Some journeys are not meant to move forward. Francistown sits in the hills of southern New Hampshire, a small town that has never held more than a few thousand souls, and for most of its history held far fewer. It was incorporated in 1772, carved from wilderness by families seeking distance from the coastal settlements and the complications of colonial politics. The terrain is rolling and forested, cut by streams that feed the Piscataquag River, shadowed by the modest bulk of Crotched Mountain to the north. The soil is rocky, the winters are long. The people who settled here were not seeking ease. The town's first meeting house was raised in 1775, a simple timber structure on a hill overlooking the common. It served as church, town hall, and gathering place for a community that numbered fewer than 200. The minister was a man named Reverend Josiah Caldwell, a graduate of Harvard College who had come to Francistown in 1773 and would remain until his death in 1809. He was known as a serious man, meticulous in his record-keeping, skeptical of enthusiasm and superstition in equal measure. His journal, maintained daily for over 30 years, was considered lost until 1912, when it was discovered in a trunk belonging to his great-granddaughter in Concord. Most of the entries are mundane, weather observations, sermon notes, records of births and deaths. But the entries from April of 1789 are different. The pages for April 12th through April 18th are blank except for a single line, written on April 19th in handwriting that trembles noticeably compared to Caldwell's usual precise script. They have learned the direction home. He never explained what this meant. He never referenced the incident again. The events of April 17th, 1789, were not recorded by Reverend Caldwell, but they were documented by others, primarily in letters and town records that surfaced gradually over the following 2 centuries. The most detailed account comes from a letter written by a farmer named Ezekiel Woodbury to his brother in Portsmouth, dated April 22, 1789. The letter was preserved in the Woodbury family papers and donated to the New Hampshire Historical Society in 1947. According to Woodbury, he was returning home from his fields at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon when he encountered a group of people on the old county road, which ran from the meeting house north toward Crotched Mountain. The group consisted of 11 individuals, 7 women, 3 men, and 1 child of approximately 12 years. Woodbury recognized all of them. They were members of the congregation, people he had seen at meeting just 3 days prior. They were walking backward, not stumbling, not shuffling, but walking in perfect unison, their steps synchronized as if rehearsed. Their eyes were open, fixed straight ahead, which meant they were looking at where they had been rather than where they were going. Their mouths moved in unison as well, producing a low humming sound that Woodbury described as a hymn tune, though none I have ever heard sung. Woodbury called out to them. None responded. He approached and touched the arm of a woman named Patience Cummings. She did not acknowledge him. Her skin, he noted, was cold, though the afternoon was mild. He released her arm and stepped back. The group continued past him without pause, their backward march carrying them steadily north. He followed at a distance for nearly an hour, uncertain what to do. The group never stopped, never varied their pace, never broke their formation. The humming continued without interruption. At the base of Crotched Mountain, approximately 6 miles from the meeting house, they stopped. They stood motionless for several minutes. Then, as if awakening from sleep, they turned around, looked at each other with apparent confusion, and began asking where they were and how they had come to be there. None of them remembered anything after leaving the meeting house that morning. Ezekiel Woodbury was not the only witness. A tavern keeper named Solomon Flagg reported seeing the group pass his establishment on the old county road. He confirmed the backward walking and the synchronized humming. He described the hymn as mournful but not unpleasant, and noted that he felt compelled to follow them but chose not to. "Something in me said to let them pass," he wrote in a deposition given to the town selectmen 3 days later. A farm wife named Abigail Corliss observed the group from her window as they passed her property. She reported that the child, a girl named Mercy Blanchard, appeared to be leading the formation, though she walked at the rear since the group moved backward. Corliss described Mercy's expression as serene, like one who knows a pleasant secret. The selectmen's records from April 1789 are incomplete. Several pages appear to have been removed at some point, and the minutes from the meeting held on April 20th reference the matter of the walking without elaboration. A motion was passed to speak no more of this to outsiders, which suggests the town leadership wished to suppress the story. Reverend Caldwell was present at that meeting, but is not recorded as having spoken. The 11 individuals who participated in the walk were interviewed by the selectmen. Their accounts were consistent. They remembered attending morning prayers at the meeting house. They remembered the beginning of Reverend Caldwell's sermon. They remembered nothing after that until they found themselves standing at the foot of Crotched Mountain, confused and fatigued, with no understanding of how they had traveled 6 miles without awareness. The hymn they had been humming was described differently by each witness. Woodbury called it melancholy, Flagg called it ancient sounding, and Corliss said it reminded her of something my grandmother might have known. None of the 11 remembered humming anything. When asked to reproduce the tune, none could recall it. Attempts to explain the incident have never reached consensus. In 1923, a professor of psychology at the University of New Hampshire named Dr. Harold Kimball examined the available documents and proposed that the event was a case of mass hysteria, possibly triggered by ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and altered states of consciousness. Similar explanations have been proposed for the Salem witch trials a century earlier. But there are problems with this theory. Ergot poisoning typically produces violent symptoms, seizures, vomiting, sensations of burning. The 11 walkers displayed none of these. Their movement was coordinated, not chaotic. Their behavior suggested not illness, but purpose. A folklorist named Margaret Holbrook, writing in 1951, proposed a different interpretation. She noted that backward walking appears in various folk traditions as a ritual of protection or reversal, a way of undoing a curse, returning to a previous state, or confusing malevolent spirits that might follow. She suggested the Francistown incident might represent a survival of older European folk practices, carried out unconsciously by people who no longer remembered their meaning. But this theory does not explain the synchronization, the shared hymn, or the complete amnesia experienced by all 11 participants. The town records offer no further clarification. After April of 1789, there are no references to the incident in any official document. The meeting house continued to operate as it had before. Reverend Caldwell continued his ministry for another 20 years. The 11 walkers resumed their normal lives and, as far as records indicate, never experienced anything similar again. Mercy Blanchard, the child who had led the formation, grew up, married, and moved to Vermont in 1807. She lived until 1862. Her descendants, interviewed by a local historian in 1938, reported that she never spoke of the incident, but that she refused throughout her entire life to walk on the old county road. The most troubling element of the case may be the hymn itself. No record of the tune exists. Despite descriptions from 3 independent witnesses, no musicologist has been able to identify it. Hymn books from the period have been exhaustively cataloged. No melody matching the witnesses' descriptions has been found. In 1967, a graduate student at the New England Conservatory named Ruth Lindqvist attempted to reconstruct the hymn based on the written accounts. She produced 3 possible melodies and played them for descendants of the Francistown families. One of them, a woman named Dorothy Blanchard Hastings, a great-great-great-granddaughter of Mercy Blanchard, reacted unexpectedly. She became pale, asked Lindqvist to stop playing, and left the room. When contacted later, she declined to discuss her reaction. She died in 1972, and her family reported that she had requested not to be buried in New Hampshire. The old county road still exists, though it is now a seasonal dirt track used primarily by hikers and hunters. It runs from the site of the original meeting house, demolished in 1841, to the base of Crotched Mountain, a distance of approximately 6 miles. Locals who know the story tend to avoid it after dark. A hiking guide published in 2015 includes a brief mention of the 1789 incident, describing it as one of New Hampshire's more peculiar historical footnotes. The author notes, almost as an afterthought, that several hikers over the years have reported hearing faint singing on the road, particularly in April. The singing, they say, seems to come from ahead of them, but when they turn around, it sounds like it's coming from behind. Some bells call to the living. Others receive answers from somewhere else. Canterbury is a small town in Merrimack County, New Hampshire, situated on rolling hills approximately 15 miles north of Concord. It was settled in 1727 and incorporated in 1741, making it one of the older communities in the central part of the state. The town is perhaps best known for its Shaker Village, established in 1792. But before the Shakers arrived, Canterbury was a conventional New England farming community with a congregational meeting house at its center. The Union Congregational Church was built in 1783 on a modest rise overlooking the town common. The original structure was typical of its era: white clapboard, clear glass windows, a square tower housing a bell that summoned the faithful to worship and marked the hours of community life. The bell was cast in 1791 by a foundry in Boston, replacing a smaller bell that had cracked during the harsh winter of 1789. The new bell was unremarkable in most respects. It weighed approximately 800 pounds, was cast from bronze in the traditional manner, and produced a clear, resonant tone that could be heard across the valley on still days. It was inscribed with the year of its casting and the words Gloria Deo, glory to God. For the first 12 years of its service, the bell performed exactly as expected. Then, in the autumn of 1803, something changed. The first documented incident occurred on the evening of October 7, 1803. The sexton, a man named Nathaniel Hoyt, was ringing the bell for evening prayers when he noticed something unusual. After each stroke of the clapper, a second tone sounded, lower in pitch, slightly delayed, as if the bell's voice were being answered by another. Hoyt assumed it was an echo, perhaps caused by some peculiarity of the autumn air, or a new building that had altered the acoustics of the common. He completed his duties and mentioned the phenomenon to no one. But the following Sunday, October 9th, multiple congregation members reported hearing the same thing. The Reverend Samuel Ambrose noted in his weekly letter to his brother in Boston that the bell has acquired a strange companion tone, which some parishioners find unsettling. He attributed it to atmospheric conditions and suggested it would likely cease with the change of seasons. It did not cease. Throughout October of 1803, the answering tone persisted. It occurred only during certain ringings, never at noon, never at dawn, only during the evening hours, and only on certain days that followed no discernible pattern. The tone was consistent in character, lower than the bell's natural voice by approximately a minor third, with a hollow quality that several witnesses described as mournful or subterranean. By November, the selectmen had become involved. A committee was formed to investigate the phenomenon. Their report, preserved in the town archives, concluded that the secondary tone is of unknown origin and does not appear to emanate from the bell itself. They recommended that the bell be examined by a qualified expert. A bell founder from Concord, named Josiah Pemberton, was engaged to inspect the instrument. His assessment, submitted on November 18, 1803, found nothing amiss. The bell was properly cast, properly hung, and properly tuned. There was no crack, no flaw, no mechanical explanation for the answering tone. Pemberton suggested, somewhat hesitantly, that the sound might be coming from below the church. The selectmen did not pursue this suggestion publicly, but private correspondence suggests they took it seriously. In a letter dated December 2, 1803, Selectman Jonathan Rowell wrote to his cousin in Portsmouth describing a midnight experiment conducted by the committee. 3 men had entered the church after dark, Rowell himself, Pemberton the bell founder, and Reverend Ambrose. They had rung the bell while a 4th man, the sexton Nathaniel Hoyt, listened from the cellar. Hoyt reported that the answering tone was louder in the cellar than in the sanctuary above. It seemed to originate, he said, from beneath the cellar floor itself, from somewhere in the earth below the foundation. The committee ordered the cellar floor examined. Workers found nothing unusual. Packed earth over stone, undisturbed since the church's construction 20 years earlier. There was no hollow space, no buried chamber, no explanation for what Hoyt had heard. The selectmen chose not to publicize these findings. The minutes of their December meeting contain a resolution to make no further inquiry into the matter of the bell and to discourage speculation among the townspeople. The investigation was quietly closed. The answering tone continued. For the next 2 centuries, it appeared intermittently, always in autumn, always during evening ringings, always with the same hollow subterranean quality. Generation after generation of Canterbury residents heard it, discussed it privately, and followed the unspoken tradition of not discussing it with outsiders. The bell was replaced in 1879 after developing a crack. The new bell did not produce an answering tone, but by then the phenomenon had shifted. Parishioners began reporting that they could hear the answering tone even when no bell was rung. The first such account comes from a church elder named Harriet Goodwin, who recorded in her diary in September of 1891 that she had heard the lower bell while sitting alone in the sanctuary on a Tuesday afternoon. No one had rung anything. The tower was empty, yet she distinctly heard the mournful tone rising from somewhere below her feet, sustaining for several seconds before fading. Similar reports accumulated over the following decades. A minister's wife in 1908, a Sunday school teacher in 1923, a custodian in 1947. The experiences were consistent. A low, resonant tone, heard inside the church, emanating from below, occurring without any apparent trigger. Those who heard it described a peculiar emotional effect. The tone was not frightening, they said, but deeply sad. A sound that evoked grief without explaining its source. Several witnesses reported feeling compelled to respond in some way, though none could articulate what kind of response was expected. The original bell, the one cast in 1791, had been preserved in a storage shed behind the church. In 1956, a local historian named Arthur Dennison proposed that it be examined using modern acoustic equipment. The church board declined. In 1983, the shed was demolished to make room for a parking expansion. The bell was moved to the basement of the Town Historical Society, where it remains today. Employees at the Historical Society have reported hearing it ring on autumn evenings, though it hangs silent on its display mount, and no one has touched it in years. The most significant investigation occurred in 2014. A team of researchers from the University of New Hampshire, conducting a survey of colonial-era church foundations, obtained permission to use ground-penetrating radar on the Canterbury site. Their objective was to map the original foundation and identify any structural anomalies that might inform preservation efforts. What they found was unexpected. Approximately 17 feet below the church floor, the radar detected a void, an empty cavity roughly 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet in height. The cavity was roughly spherical, with smooth walls that suggested deliberate construction rather than natural formation. The researchers were puzzled. Colonial-era churches did not typically include subterranean chambers. The cavity was too deep to be a root cellar, too regular to be a collapsed well, too isolated to be part of any known architectural tradition. More troubling still, there was no entrance. The cavity appeared to be completely sealed, surrounded on all sides by undisturbed soil and stone. If something had been buried there, it had been buried before the church was built, or it had arrived by some other means. The researchers recommended excavation. The church board declined, citing concerns about structural integrity. A second request was made in 2016. It was also declined. No explanation was provided in the board's minutes. The original survey data was submitted to the state archaeologist's office, where it was filed and, according to one researcher involved in the study, quietly forgotten. Requests to access the data through public records have been denied on grounds that it contains sensitive information regarding private property. The cavity beneath the Canterbury Church has never been opened. Its contents, if any, remain unknown. Its purpose, if any, has never been determined. Its connection to the answering tone has never been established, though those familiar with the history find the correlation difficult to ignore. The current minister of the Union Congregational Church, Reverend Diana Holbrook, has served the congregation since 2011. She is aware of the stories, she says, but has never personally witnessed the phenomenon. She describes it as part of the church's folklore and notes that every old building has its mysteries. But she acknowledges that the church does not ring its bell after sunset. It's not a policy, she said, in a 2019 interview with a regional historical magazine. It's just something we don't do. No one has ever explained why. It's simply the tradition. The article noted that Reverend Holbrook paused before adding a final comment. Sometimes, on autumn evenings, I stay late to work in my office. The building is quiet. The heat makes the usual sounds. Pipes, wood settling, nothing unusual. But once or twice I've heard something that almost sounds like a bell, very faint, very low, like something far below me is trying to answer a call. She did not elaborate on what call she meant. The bell cast in 1791 sits in the basement of the Canterbury Historical Society, silent on its wooden mount. It has not been rung in over a century, but the cavity 17 feet below the church floor remains, sealed, unmapped, unexplained. And on certain autumn evenings, when the air is still and the sanctuary is empty, some parishioners say they can still hear it, a tone from below, an answer to a question no one remembers asking. There are sermons meant for the living, and there are sermons meant for those who have not yet learned they are dead. Hopkinton lies in the Merrimack Valley of south-central New Hampshire, a town of gentle hills and old farmsteads that has existed in one form or another since 1735. It served as the state capital briefly in the early 19th century and has always carried itself with a certain quiet dignity, the kind of place where families stay for generations and where the past is neither forgotten nor particularly discussed. The first Congregational Church of Hopkinton was established in 1757, a white-steepled structure on a rise overlooking the common that has been rebuilt twice but has never moved from its original site. The church records are extensive, maintained with the meticulous care typical of New England Congregationalism. Birth and death records, meeting minutes, financial accounts. The paper trail stretches back over 2.5 centuries. Among these documents is a gap. The church records for September of 1803 exist, but they are incomplete. The minutes from the meeting of September 15th reference the extraordinary sermon of the previous day, but provide no details. A marginal note, added in a different hand at some later date, reads, "See sealed document, Cornerstone, per vote of Congregation, 1857." The sealed document was meant to preserve what the congregation could not bring themselves to destroy, but did not wish to remember. It was the funeral sermon of Reverend Ezra Whitcomb, written and delivered by Reverend Ezra Whitcomb himself, 11 days before he died. Ezra Whitcomb came to Hopkinton in 1789, a young minister fresh from Yale College, eager and orthodox in his theology. He served the congregation faithfully for 14 years, baptizing children, marrying couples, burying the dead. He was respected, if not beloved, a man of precise habits and careful speech who kept his sermons to exactly 30 minutes and his opinions to himself. In the summer of 1803, Whitcomb was 51 years old and in apparent good health. The church records from July and August show nothing unusual: routine business, ordinary services, the regular rhythm of a settled parish. Then came Sunday, September 14th. The weather that morning was clear and warm, a late summer day with no hint of autumn. The congregation gathered as usual, approximately 80 souls, according to the sexton's count. Reverend Whitcomb entered the pulpit at the customary time, opened his Bible, and began to speak. What followed was not a normal sermon. According to multiple accounts preserved in family letters and later depositions, Whitcomb announced that he would be delivering a funeral sermon. The congregation assumed he was speaking metaphorically, perhaps addressing mortality in the abstract, as ministers often did. Then he named the deceased, himself. The most complete account of the sermon comes from a letter written by a parishioner named Hannah Eastman to her sister in Concord, dated September 16, 1803, 2 days after the event and 9 days before Whitcomb's death. The Reverend spoke as if reading from a prepared text, Eastman wrote, though he held no paper. He described his own death as having already occurred. He gave the date, September 25th, and the hour, which he said would be shortly after midnight. He described the weather on the day of his burial, overcast, with a light rain beginning in the afternoon, and the flowers on his coffin, which he said would be asters from the Kimball garden. Eastman's letter continues with details that would prove unsettlingly accurate. Whitcomb named his 6 pallbearers: Josiah Kimball, Thomas Straw, Benjamin Wigan, Nathaniel Martin, Samuel Danforth, and William Chandler. He described the text that would be inscribed on his gravestone. He quoted from a letter of condolence that he said would be written by the Reverend Amos Blanchard of Pembroke, offering specific phrases that Blanchard would use to describe their friendship. He spoke for perhaps 40 minutes, Eastman wrote, though it felt much longer. None of us moved, none of us spoke. When he finished, he closed his Bible, descended from the pulpit, and walked out of the church without another word. We sat in silence for some time after. I do not know how long. The congregation did not know how to respond. Some believed Whitcomb had suffered a mental collapse. Others suspected he had received a divine revelation. A few quietly suggested he had been possessed by something that was not God. The selectmen called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Whitcomb did not attend. He was found in the parsonage, sitting at his desk, calmly writing letters as if nothing unusual had occurred. When asked about the sermon, he reportedly said only, "I have done what was required of me." Ezra Whitcomb died on September 25, 1803, shortly after midnight. The cause of death was recorded as sudden failure of the heart. He had shown no symptoms of illness in the intervening 11 days. He had continued his duties, visited parishioners, and conducted a midweek prayer service. Those who spoke with him reported that he seemed at peace, perhaps more at peace than they had ever seen him. The weather on the day of his burial, September 27th, was overcast, with a light rain beginning in the afternoon. The pallbearers were Josiah Kimball, Thomas Straw, Benjamin Wigan, Nathaniel Martin, Samuel Danforth, and William Chandler, the same 6 men Whitcomb had named in his sermon, though none of them had been asked to serve until after his death. The flowers on his coffin were asters from the Kimball Garden. 3 weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived from Reverend Amos Blanchard of Pembroke. The letter expressed condolences and described Blanchard's friendship with Whitcomb. The phrasing matched, almost word for word, the quotes Whitcomb had spoken from the pulpit. Blanchard had not heard of Whitcomb's death until September 30th. He had written the letter on October 2nd. The congregation did not know what to make of any of this. The new minister who arrived in 1804 was instructed not to speak of his predecessor. The sermon was transcribed from the memories of those who had heard it, and the transcription was placed in a locked box in the church vault. In 1857, during renovations to the church, the congregation voted to seal the document in the new cornerstone. The stated reason, according to the meeting minutes, was to preserve the record for future generations while removing it from present contemplation. The cornerstone was mortared shut with appropriate ceremony. The document was inside. The matter was considered closed. The cornerstone was opened on June 12, 1983. The occasion was the church's 225th anniversary. A time capsule had been suggested, and the Historical Committee proposed incorporating items from the 1857 cornerstone into the new one. Permission was obtained. A mason was hired. The congregation gathered to witness the opening. The cornerstone had not been disturbed. The mortar was original, undamaged, showing no signs of tampering. The mason carefully removed the capstone and reached inside. The cavity was empty. Not empty of everything. There were coins from 1857, a copy of the church covenant, a list of congregation members. But the sealed box containing Whitcomb's sermon was gone. Only a faint rectangular impression in the dust indicated it had ever been there. The mason was questioned. He had no explanation. The cornerstone had been sealed for 126 years. No one had opened it. No one could have opened it. The church formed a committee to investigate. They found nothing. The box had simply vanished from a sealed stone chamber that had not been breached. A local historian named Dorothy Westbrook, who had been researching the Whitcomb incident for a book on New Hampshire folklore, requested access to any surviving copies of the sermon. There were none. The transcription placed in the cornerstone had been the only complete record. Fragments existed in letters and family traditions, but the full text was lost. Westbrook published her book in 1989. She included a chapter on Whitcomb, but was forced to rely on second-hand accounts. She noted, in her conclusion, that the disappearance of the sermon seemed almost deliberate, as if the document had fulfilled its purpose and removed itself from the historical record. "It is tempting to speculate," she wrote, "that Reverend Whitcomb's final sermon was not meant to be preserved. Perhaps it was meant only to be delivered once to one congregation on one September morning, and then forgotten. Perhaps some prophecies are not meant to outlast their fulfillment." The First Congregational Church of Hopkinton continues to hold services every Sunday. Reverend Whitcomb's grave remains in the old cemetery behind the church, marked by a simple stone that bears his name, his dates, and a brief inscription. The inscription matches, word for word, what witnesses reported he had predicted in his sermon. No one knows how he knew. No one knows where the sermon went. The cornerstone from 1983 contains a new time capsule filled with photographs and newspapers and letters from congregation members. It is scheduled to be opened in 2057, 200 years after the previous sealing. The committee that assembled the capsule debated whether to include any reference to the Whitcomb incident. They decided against it. "Some stories," the committee chair said at the time, "are better left unsealed." But the rectangular impression remains in the original cornerstone cavity, a faint outline in century-old dust, marking the space where a document once rested. A document that described a death before it happened. a document that named mourners before they knew they would mourn, a document that, like the man who wrote it, seems to have known exactly when its time was finished. Empty rooms do not sing, but something in this one did. The Old North Church of Concord stands on North Main Street, a few blocks from the New Hampshire State House, in the heart of the city that has served as the state capital since 1808. The church was built in 1842, a brick structure in the Greek Revival style, with a prominent white steeple that remains one of the defining features of the Concord skyline. It has served continuously as a place of worship for over 180 years, surviving fires, renovations, and the slow erosion of its original congregation. By 1971, the building was showing its age. The foundation had settled unevenly, causing cracks in the plaster and gaps in the window frames. The choir loft, a wooden gallery at the rear of the sanctuary, had developed a noticeable sag. The church board commissioned a structural assessment, which recommended immediate restoration to prevent further deterioration. The work began in September of that year. A construction firm from Manchester was engaged to reinforce the foundation, repair the choir loft, and address various issues throughout the building. The project was expected to take 3 months. As part of the restoration, a structural engineer named Harold Lindgren recommended installing temporary audio monitoring equipment in the choir loft. The equipment, a reel-to-reel tape recorder connected to a sensitive microphone, would detect sounds of settling, cracking, or movement in the wooden structure. The tapes would be reviewed each morning to identify any areas requiring immediate attention. The system was installed on September 23, 1971. It was set to record continuously from 8 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning, when the work crew arrived. For the first 3 nights, the tapes captured nothing unusual. The expected creaks and groans of an old building, the distant sounds of traffic, the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. On the 4th night, September 27th, the tapes captured something else. The first anomalous recording runs for approximately 7 minutes, beginning at 2:43 in the morning. Harold Lindgren was the first to hear it. He had arrived early on September 28th to review the previous night's tape, as was his routine. He listened through the expected ambient sounds, the settling noises, the faint hum of the heating system. Then, at the 2-hour and 43-minute mark, something changed. Voices. Human voices, singing in 4-part harmony, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the unmistakable structure of a church choir. The sound was faint but clear, captured with the crisp precision of the professional-grade microphone Lindgren had installed. The voices rose and fell in a melodic pattern that Lindgren, a lifelong church-goer, immediately recognized as hymn-like in structure. But he did not recognize the hymn, and he did not recognize the language. Lindgren stopped the tape and rewound it. He listened again. The voices were still there, measured, reverent, harmonically sophisticated. He checked the equipment. Everything was functioning normally. He checked the church records. The building had been locked and alarmed at 7:30 the previous evening. No one had entered overnight. The alarm had not been triggered. He contacted the church sexton, a man named Robert Farnsworth, who confirmed that the building had been empty. He contacted the alarm company, which verified that no doors or windows had been opened between 7:30 and 5:45 when the work crew arrived. Lindgren did not know what to do with this information. He set the tape aside and continued his work. That evening, he reset the monitoring system and waited. The voices returned the following night, and the night after that. Over the next 17 nights, the audio monitoring equipment captured 14 separate recordings of the phantom choir. The recordings varied in length. The shortest was approximately 3 minutes, the longest nearly 22. They occurred at different times, though always between midnight and 4 in the morning. The singing was always in the same style, 4-part harmony, measured tempo, hymn-like structure. The voices were always the same number and approximate range, suggesting a choir of perhaps 12 to 16 singers. The melody was consistent across all recordings, a single hymn repeated with minor variations. Lindgren, who had some musical training, transcribed the melody and shared it with colleagues. A music professor at the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Eleanor Vance, identified it as a variant of Saint Anne, a hymn tune composed by William Croft in 1708, commonly associated with the text, "O God, our help in ages past." But the version on the tapes differed from any known arrangement. The harmonic progressions were unusual, almost archaic, and the lyrics, if they were lyrics, were in no language Dr. Vance or any of her colleagues could identify. The phonemes are consistent with human speech, Vance wrote in an assessment she provided to the church board. The singers are clearly articulating words, not merely vocalizing, but the language does not correspond to any European tongue I am familiar with. It is not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not any Germanic or Romance language. The structure suggests a developed language with consistent grammatical patterns, but I cannot identify it. Vance requested permission to conduct further analysis. The church board declined, citing concerns about publicity and the potential for sensationalism. The construction crew was largely unaware of the recordings. Lindgren had chosen not to share his findings widely, uncertain of how they would be received. But rumors spread among the workers, as rumors do on construction sites. A carpenter named James Pelletier reported to his supervisor that he had heard singing while working late one evening, faint, distant, coming from the direction of the choir loft. He had investigated and found the loft empty. He assumed it was a radio from a neighboring building. A plasterer named Antonio Ferreira described a similar experience. He had been repairing cracks in the sanctuary ceiling when he heard what he called church music coming from above him. He looked up at the choir loft. No one was there. The sound faded within seconds. Both men submitted incident reports, which were filed with the construction company and later obtained by researchers through public records requests. Neither report was investigated at the time. The church's minister, Reverend David Haskell, was informed of the recordings in mid-October. His response, preserved in a letter to the church board, was measured but firm. "I have listened to one of the recordings provided by Mr. Lindgren," Haskell wrote. "I do not doubt that the sounds are genuine. I do not believe they represent any threat to the building or its occupants. I recommend that the tapes be preserved but not publicized, and that the restoration work continue as planned. Whatever is singing in our choir loft has been there longer than any of us. I see no reason to disturb it." The board accepted Haskell's recommendation. The monitoring equipment was removed when the restoration was completed in December. The tapes were placed in a locked cabinet in the church office. The recordings remained in church custody until 1989, when they were donated to the New Hampshire Historical Society as part of a larger collection of materials related to the Old North Church's history. The donation was routine. The tapes were cataloged, assigned an accession number, and placed in the Society's audio archive. A brief description was entered into the finding aid. Audio recordings, Old North Church Restoration Project, 1971, 17 reels. Contained structural monitoring data and unidentified ambient sounds. For over 2 decades, no one requested access to the tapes. Then, in 2012, a graduate student at Dartmouth College named Michelle Okonkwo discovered a reference to the recordings while researching acoustic anomalies in historic buildings. She contacted the Historical Society and requested permission to listen to the tapes. Her request was denied. The Society informed her that the recordings were currently unavailable for research due to preservation concerns. She asked when they might become available. She was told there was no timeline. She asked if the tapes had been damaged. She received no response. Okonkwo filed a formal inquiry with the Society's Board of Directors. She was informed that the matter had been reviewed and that the original decision stood. The tapes remained unavailable. In 2015, a journalist named Brian Callahan attempted to obtain the recordings through a Freedom of Information Act request. The Society, as a private nonprofit, was not subject to FOIA. Callahan reached out to former employees and board members, seeking anyone who might have heard the tapes or could explain why they were restricted. He found one, a retired archivist named Constance Whitfield, who had processed the donation in 1989. "I listened to them," Whitfield told Callahan in an interview, "all of them. I was curious. The quality was excellent, much better than I expected from that era of equipment. And the singing was beautiful, haunting, but beautiful." She paused before continuing. "I made a copy for myself. I know I shouldn't have, but I wanted to study it, to understand what language they were using. I played it for my husband that evening. He listened for about 30 seconds, then asked me to turn it off. He said it made him feel like he was intruding on something, like we were hearing something we weren't supposed to hear." Whitfield said she erased her copy the following day. She could not explain why. "I just knew I didn't want it in my house," she said. "I can still hear it sometimes in my memory. That melody, those words I couldn't understand. It's not frightening exactly. It's more like grief. Like a choir singing at a funeral for someone I never met but somehow miss." The Old North Church continues to hold services every Sunday. The choir loft was fully restored in 1971 and remains in use, occupied by a volunteer choir of approximately 20 members who sing traditional hymns from the standard repertoire. None of them have reported hearing anything unusual. The tapes remain in the custody of the New Hampshire Historical Society, cataloged but inaccessible. The Society's website lists them as restricted, preservation review pending. No preservation review has been scheduled. Reverend David Haskell served the Old North Church until his retirement in 1994. He died in 2007. His personal papers, donated to the church archive, include a single reference to the recordings, a handwritten note, undated, tucked into his Bible. "I have heard them again," the note reads. "Not on tape, in the sanctuary last night, after everyone had gone. The same hymn, the same voices. They do not know I am listening, or perhaps they do not care. I believe they have always been here. I believe they will always be here. And I believe the language they sing is not unknown. It is simply forgotten. A language we once spoke, in a place we once knew, before we learned to be afraid of the dark." The note does not elaborate. The choir loft stands empty each night after the church is locked. But the microphone is gone now, and no one is recording what sings in the silence. Wood does not remember warmth. It conducts, absorbs, and releases, but it does not hold. Except here. Danville is a small town in southeastern New Hampshire, midway between the coast and the Merrimack Valley, a place of approximately 4,000 residents spread across country roads and wooded hills. It was settled in the early 18th century and incorporated in 1760 under the name Hawke, in honor of a British admiral. The name was changed to Danville in 1836, long after the Revolution had made honoring British admirals unfashionable. The old meeting house of Danville stands on a gentle rise at the center of town, a white clapboard structure built in 1755. It is one of the oldest surviving meeting houses in New Hampshire, a simple rectangular building with clear glass windows, wooden pews arranged in the traditional box style, and a raised pulpit at the front. The building has no central heating. It has never had central heating. In winter, congregants historically relied on foot warmers filled with hot coals, and services were kept mercifully brief. The meeting house is no longer used for regular worship. The congregation moved to a newer church in 1873, but it has been preserved as a historical landmark. maintained by the Danville Historical Society and opened for tours, weddings, and occasional community events. The interior remains largely unchanged from its original configuration, including the numbered box pews that once belonged to specific families. Pew number 7 is in the third row from the front, on the left side of the center aisle. It is indistinguishable from the other pews in construction: pine boards, hand-forged iron hinges, the same worn patina of 2.5 centuries of use. But pew number 7 is not like the other pews. Pew number 7 is warm. The anomaly was first formally documented in 1964, though local knowledge of it extends much further back. In the summer of that year, a graduate student from the University of New Hampshire named Theodore Osgood was conducting a survey of colonial-era architecture in Rockingham County. His project involved photographing and measuring historic structures, including the Danville Meeting House. During his visit on August 14th, he placed his hand on the seat of pew number 7 and noticed something unusual. The wood was warm. Not faintly warm, not ambient temperature warm, but distinctly, noticeably warm, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. Osgood checked the other pews. They were cool, as expected in an unheated building on a mild summer day. He returned to pew number 7, still warm. Osgood mentioned the phenomenon to the Historical Society volunteer who had let him into the building, a retired schoolteacher named Harriet Newcomb. She nodded, unsurprised. "It's always been that way," she said. "My grandmother told me about it when I was a girl. She said her grandmother told her. Nobody knows why. We just don't talk about it much." Osgood was intrigued. He returned the following day with a thermometer and took readings from multiple pews. The ambient temperature in the building was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The surface temperature of pew number 4 was 67 degrees. Pew number 12 was 69 degrees. Pew number 7 was 98.6 degrees. Human body temperature, exactly. Osgood included his findings in his thesis, which was submitted to the university in 1965. His advisor, a professor of architectural history named Dr. Warren Caldwell, was skeptical but curious. He arranged for a more rigorous examination of the pew in the spring of 1966. A team of 3 researchers, Caldwell, a physicist named Dr. Margaret Holbrook, and an engineer named Paul Fontaine, spent 2 days examining pew number 7. They used precision thermometers, infrared sensors, and thermal imaging equipment borrowed from the physics department. Their findings were consistent with Osgood's initial observations. The surface temperature of pew number 7 was 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, consistent across all measurements at all times of day, regardless of ambient conditions. The pew was tested in the morning when the building was coldest. It was tested in the afternoon, after sunlight had warmed the interior. It was tested at night, with the doors and windows sealed. The temperature never varied. Dr. Holbrook conducted a thorough examination of the pew's construction. She found no heating elements, no chemical heat packs, no unusual materials. The wood was standard white pine, consistent with the other pews. The iron hardware was hand-forged, showing no signs of modern modification. There was no power source, no wiring, no mechanical explanation. "The pew is generating heat," Holbrook wrote in her report, or more precisely, maintaining a temperature consistent with human body heat through a mechanism I cannot identify. The laws of thermodynamics require energy input to maintain a temperature differential against ambient conditions. I can find no source of that energy. The team briefly considered the possibility of fraud, a heating element hidden somewhere, a prank by locals, but dismissed it. The phenomenon had been observed for generations. The Historical Society volunteers had no motive for deception, and the precision of the temperature, exactly 98.6 degrees, human body temperature to 1/10 of a degree, argued against any simple mechanical explanation. The investigation might have ended there, filed away as a curiosity, if not for what the researchers found in the church records. Dr. Caldwell, pursuing the historical angle, requested access to the meeting house's original documents. The Danville Historical Society provided him with a collection of papers dating back to the building's construction in 1755. Among these was a seating chart from 1749, 6 years before the meeting house was built, assigning pews to the families who had pledged funds for its construction. The chart listed pew assignments for families with names still familiar in the region: Colby, Sanborn, Tuck, Pillsbury. Each pew was marked with a family name and the amount of their pledge. Pew number 7 was different. Where a family name should have appeared, there was only a notation: reserved for one who has not yet arrived. No pledge amount was listed. No family was assigned. The pew had been set aside from the very beginning for someone who did not exist, or did not yet exist. Caldwell searched for additional references to the reservation. He found only one in the minutes of a church meeting from October of 1762. The entry was brief. The matter of Pew 7 was again discussed. The Reverend Mr. Webster counseled patience. The reservation stands. No further explanation was provided. No subsequent minutes mention the pew or its mysterious occupant. The phenomenon has been examined multiple times since 1966, each investigation reaching the same conclusion: the temperature is real, it is constant, and it cannot be explained. In 1982, a team from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology conducted a 3-day study using equipment far more sophisticated than anything available in the 1960s. They confirmed the 98.6-degree reading and added new data. The heat appeared to emanate from the center of the seat, as if someone were sitting there. Thermal imaging showed a vaguely human-shaped warm zone, roughly consistent with the heat distribution of a seated adult. But there was no one there. In 2004, a physicist from Dartmouth College named Dr. Yuki Tanaka proposed a theory involving localized geothermal activity, a small pocket of warm earth beneath the building that might be transferring heat upward through the foundation. She conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys and found nothing unusual. The soil beneath the meeting house was the same temperature as the surrounding area. There was no geothermal source. In 2016, a paranormal investigation team requested permission to spend a night in the meeting house with various detection equipment. The Historical Society declined, citing concerns about the building's preservation. The team's leader, a retired police detective named Frank Napolitano, visited during regular hours and confirmed the temperature anomaly, but was unable to offer any explanation. "I've investigated a lot of strange claims," Napolitano told a local newspaper. "Most of them turn out to be nothing. Misunderstandings, hoaxes, natural phenomena that people don't recognize. This is different. The pew is warm. It shouldn't be warm. It's been warm for as long as anyone can remember. I don't know what that means, but I know it's real." The Historical Society has, over the years, adopted an unofficial policy of not drawing attention to the pew. Docents are instructed to answer questions honestly if asked, but not to raise the subject themselves. The pew is not roped off, not marked with any sign or placard. Visitors are welcome to sit in it if they choose, though many report an uncomfortable feeling, not of fear, but of intrusion, as if they were taking someone else's seat. A woman named Rebecca Thornton, who visited the meeting house in 2011 while researching her family genealogy, described the experience in a blog post that circulated briefly online. "I sat in Pew 7 without knowing its history," she wrote. "I just picked it at random. The wood was warm, which I thought was strange because the rest of the building was cold. But what struck me more was the feeling. I felt like I was sitting next to someone, not in a scary way, more like the sense you get when someone is standing just behind you, waiting politely for you to notice them. I turned to look. No one was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was keeping someone's seat warm for them." She concluded her post with a question that others have asked over the years. Who was Pew 7 reserved for? Did they ever arrive? And if not, are they still expected? The old meeting house of Danville remains open to visitors from May through October. The building is unheated, as it has always been. The pews are original, numbered, arranged in the same configuration as they were in 1755. Pew number 7 maintains its temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, decade after decade, century after century. The wood does not decay. The warmth does not fade. Whatever sits there, invisible and patient, continues to wait. The church records offer no further clues. The reservation from 1749 has never been fulfilled, or if it has, no one has recorded the arrival. The Reverend Mr. Webster, who counseled patience in 1762, died in 1781. His gravestone stands in the old cemetery behind the meeting house, weathered and tilted, inscribed with the usual pieties about resurrection and eternal rest. He did not mention pew number 7 in his will, but the sexton who succeeded him, a man named Josiah Clement, left a single note among his papers, discovered in 1937 and now held by the Historical Society. The note is undated and without context. It reads, "The seat is warm because the one who will sit there has not yet learned to be cold. When they arrive, the warmth will fade. Until then, it waits, as we all wait, for what has been promised, but not delivered." The note does not explain what was promised. The pew does not explain who is expected. The warmth continues, steady and patient, in a building that has no heat and has never had heat, in a seat reserved for someone who has not yet arrived. 270 years later, the reservation still stands. Records are kept to prove that people existed. But what happens when the records cannot agree? Newington is one of the smallest and oldest towns in New Hampshire, a narrow strip of land on the western shore of Great Bay, bounded by the Piscataqua River to the north and the town of Portsmouth to the east. It was settled in the 1630s as part of the original Dover Grant and incorporated as a separate parish in 1713. The town has never been large. Its current population is less than 800, but it has always been prosperous, its residents sustained by fishing, farming, and the maritime trades that flourished along the tidal estuary. The town's records are extensive, preserved with the meticulous care typical of New England communities that understood the importance of documentation in establishing property rights, tax obligations, and civic order. Birth records, death records, marriage records, land transfers, tax assessments, church memberships, militia rolls. The paper trail stretches back over 3 centuries, offering a detailed portrait of who lived in Newington and when. Except for one family. The Varings appear exactly once in the official census of Newington, the 1712 enumeration conducted by the colonial government to assess the population and resources of the province. The census lists 43 households, each identified by the head of family, with counts of adult males, adult females, children, servants, and enslaved persons. The church membership roll from the same year, maintained separately by the meeting house, lists 44 families. The additional family is the Varings. The discrepancy was first noted in 1876 by a local historian named Nathaniel Pickering, who was compiling a comprehensive history of Newington for the town's centennial celebration. Pickering had access to both the colonial census records held at the state archives in Concord and the original church membership rolls preserved in the meeting house vestry. The census listed 43 households. The church roll listed 44. The difference was one family, Varing. Pickering searched for additional references to the name. He found none. No Varing appeared in any land record, tax assessment, militia roll, or court document from colonial New Hampshire. No Varing was buried in any cemetery in Newington or the surrounding towns. No Veering married, had children baptized, or was disciplined by the church for moral failings, the typical traces that families left in the documentary record. Yet the church roll was clear. The entry, written in the same hand as the other 43 families, read, "Veering householder, with wife and 3 children, admitted to full communion, March 1712. Pickering included a brief mention of the discrepancy in his history. In 1908, a genealogist named Martha Wentworth discovered a document that Pickering had apparently missed, a 1715 addendum to the census, filed separately from the original enumeration. The addendum was a single page, handwritten, bearing the signatures of 3 selectmen. It read, "Be it noted that the household formerly enumerated as Veering has been removed from the count of this town by order of the selectmen this 14th day of October, 1715. Reason unverifiable. No further inquiry shall be made into this matter." Wentworth was puzzled by the phrasing. Unverifiable suggested not that the Veerings had died or moved away, but that their existence could not be confirmed, that they had been counted in error, or perhaps had never existed at all. But the church roll was not amended. The Veerings remained listed among the 44 families admitted to communion in 1712. And there was another detail that Wentworth found even more troubling. The Meeting House seating chart from 1714 assigned pew number 16 to the Veering family. The pew still existed. Wentworth visited it during her research. It was a standard box pew, identical in construction to the others, located in the 5th row on the right side of the center aisle. But the wood showed unusual wear. The seat was more polished, the armrests more smooth than the surrounding pews. It looked, Wentworth noted in her research journal, as if it had been used more frequently or for a longer period than its neighbors. The pew had been used. But by whom? Wentworth attempted to trace the Veering name beyond Newington. She searched records from every town in colonial New Hampshire, every church, every court. She expanded her search to Massachusetts, Maine, and Connecticut. She found nothing. The name Veering did not appear in any colonial record in New England. It did not appear in immigration records, ship manifests, or naturalization documents. It did not appear in English parish records, German emigration lists, or Dutch colonial archives. The name seemed to have no origin, no history, no existence outside of Newington's church roll and the addendum that erased it. Wentworth consulted linguists about the name's possible etymology. Some suggested it might be a corruption of a German name, Fähring, perhaps, or Veering. Others proposed English origins, a variant of Veer or Fearing, but none could identify any family that might have used the name or explain how it came to appear in a single New Hampshire town in 1712. She also investigated the selectmen who had signed the addendum. All 3 were prominent citizens of Newington, Samuel Fabian, John Downing, and Moses Levitt. Their signatures appeared on dozens of other documents from the period, land grants, tax assessments, court orders. They were real men, verifiable men. Yet none of them left any private correspondence mentioning the Veering matter. None of their descendants recalled any family stories about a household that was removed from count. The decision had been made, documented, and then apparently forgotten. The most extensive investigation was conducted in 1963 by a professor of colonial history at the University of New Hampshire named Dr. Raymond Blodgett. Blodgett spent 2 years examining every surviving document related to early Newington. He confirmed Wentworth's findings and added new details. The church roll, he determined, was written in the hand of the Reverend Joseph Adams, who served the Newington congregation from 1702 to 1724. The handwriting was consistent throughout the document. The Veering entry was not a later addition or forgery. Blodgett also examined the Meeting House pew in detail. He arranged for a wood analyst to study the wear patterns. The analyst report concluded that the seat and armrests of pew 16 showed wear consistent with regular use over an extended period, perhaps 40 to 60 years, by multiple individuals of varying sizes. 40 to 60 years of use. But the Varings had been removed from count in 1715, just 3 years after their admission to the church. Who had been sitting in their pew for the following decades? Church records offered no answer. Pew 16 was never reassigned. It appeared on no subsequent seating charts. No family claimed it, purchased it, or was disciplined for occupying it without permission. It simply remained the Varing pew, belonging to a family that had been declared unverifiable, used by occupants who left no trace. Blodgett published his findings in a regional historical journal in 1965. His article concluded with a question he could not answer. What does it mean for a family to be unverifiable? Not deceased, not departed, not imaginary, simply unverifiable. The selectmen's language suggests they attempted to verify the Varings' existence and failed. But failed how? Failed to find them? Failed to see them? Failed to confirm they were human? He did not elaborate on this last possibility. The Newington Meeting House still stands, though it has been extensively renovated over the centuries. The original box pews were removed in 1847 and replaced with standard bench seating. Pew 16 no longer exists as a distinct structure. But during the 1847 renovation, workers documented the condition of each pew before dismantling it. Their notes, preserved in the town archives, include a single sentence about Pew 16. The Varing pew, wood shows excessive wear. Surface is warm to the touch, no explanation found. Warm. The workers noted it without comment, as if it were merely a curiosity, not a phenomenon requiring investigation. Perhaps they did not know the history. Perhaps they did not want to know. The wood from the old pews was stored in a barn on the meeting house property for several years before being disposed of. Town records indicate that most of it was burned in 1852 to clear space for new equipment. The barn no longer exists. Whatever remained of Pew 16 is gone. But the church roll survives. The Varings remain listed among the 44 families admitted to communion in 1712. No one has ever amended it. No one has ever explained why. In 2009, a genealogist named Susan Hartley conducted a DNA study of families with long histories in Newington, hoping to trace genetic connections among the original settlers. She tested descendants of the Fabians, the Downings, the Levitts, all the families whose names appeared on the 1712 census. She found no genetic markers that could not be accounted for by the known families. No mysterious bloodline, no trace of the Varings in the town's hereditary record. And yet, Hartley noted in a footnote to her study that several participants reported family traditions of the other family, stories passed down through generations about a household that had lived in Newington in the early days, that had attended meeting, that had sat in their pew each Sunday, that had been seen and spoken to, and then, one day, had simply stopped being verifiable. My grandmother used to say they were still here, one participant told Hartley. She said you could feel them in the meeting house, especially in the old days before the renovation. She said they never left, they just stopped being countable. The selectman's addendum offers no guidance on what this might mean. The Varing household was removed from count. Reason: unverifiable. No further inquiry shall be made. And for 3 centuries none has been, at least none that has produced any answers. The church roll lists 44 families. The census lists 43. The difference remains, patient and unexplained, waiting for someone to verify what the selectmen could not. Words require a hand to write them, but sometimes the hand is nowhere to be found. Rocky Hill Meeting House stands at the intersection of two rural roads in Amesbury, Massachusetts, near the border with Salisbury, New Hampshire, a geographic ambiguity that has complicated its history. The building was constructed in 1785, a simple wooden structure with a gambrel roof and a modest steeple, serving a congregation that drew from both sides of the state line. It is one of the best preserved colonial meeting houses in New England, its interior largely unchanged from its original configuration: box pews, a raised pulpit, clear glass windows that admit the pale light of the northern coast. The meeting house has not held regular services since 1839, when the congregation built a new church closer to the center of Amesbury. Since then, Rocky Hill has been preserved as a historical landmark, maintained by local preservation societies and opened occasionally for tours, weddings, and commemorative events. The building sits on a slight rise, surrounded by a burial ground where generations of congregants rest beneath weathered slate markers. It is a quiet place, a forgettable place in some ways, easy to drive past without noticing, easy to omit from historical surveys focused on larger towns and more prominent structures. But the meeting house remembers what others have forgotten, and on one Sunday in 1827, something in that building wrote a sermon that no human hand had composed. The events of July 15, 1827, were recorded in a letter written by a congregant named Patience Bartlett to her cousin in Boston, dated July 22nd. The letter was preserved in the Bartlett family papers and donated to the Amesbury Historical Society in 1941. According to Bartlett, the scheduled minister for that Sunday was a visiting preacher named Reverend Elijah Morse, who had traveled from Newburyport to fill the pulpit while the regular minister was attending to family business in New Hampshire. Morse arrived at the meeting house at approximately 9 o'clock, an hour before the scheduled service, and retired to the small vestry room behind the pulpit to prepare. At 9:45, a member of the congregation found him collapsed on the vestry floor. Morse was conscious but unable to stand. He complained of severe dizziness and a numbness in his left arm. Two men carried him outside into the fresh air, where he recovered somewhat but remained too weak to preach. A doctor was summoned from Amesbury Village. The congregation, approximately 60 souls, remained in their pews, uncertain what to do. There was no other minister present. No elder felt qualified to deliver an impromptu sermon. The custom of the time did not permit lay people to speak from the pulpit without authorization. They waited. The wait lasted nearly an hour. The doctor arrived, examined Reverend Morse, and declared that he was suffering from an affliction of the heart and must not exert himself. The service would have to be canceled. A deacon named Thomas Gould entered the meeting house to announce the cancellation. The congregation rose to leave. It was then that Gould noticed something on the pulpit lectern. A sheet of paper lay on the wooden surface, a single page filled with dense handwriting in black ink. The ink was fresh. Gould could see the faint sheen of moisture where the final words had been written. The paper had not been there when he had checked the lectern before the service. He picked it up and read the first line. A sermon on the sin of forgetting, delivered to those who have ceased to remember. Gould read further. The sermon was complete, approximately 2,000 words, structured in the traditional format of text, doctrine, and application. The handwriting was neat, consistent, and entirely unfamiliar. Gould knew the hand of every literate member of the congregation. This was not one of them. He showed the document to other deacons. None recognized the handwriting. They showed it to Reverend Morse, who had recovered enough to examine it. He confirmed that he had not written it, had not brought it with him, and had never seen it before. The paper itself was unremarkable, standard foolscap, available at any stationer. The ink appeared to be common iron gall. There was nothing unusual about the materials. Only the content and the fact that it had appeared in a locked building on a lectern that had been empty an hour before. The congregation did not know what to make of the document. Some proposed that a member of the church had written it as a prank, though no one could identify who or explain the motive. Others suggested that Reverend Morse had written it himself and forgotten, perhaps due to the same affliction that had struck him down, though Morse firmly denied this and pointed out that the handwriting did not match his own. A few parishioners whispered other possibilities. The meeting house was old, the burial ground surrounded it. Perhaps something else had written the sermon, something that had been forgotten and wished to deliver a message about forgetting. The deacons decided to read the sermon aloud, as if it had been delivered by a living minister. Thomas Gould took the pulpit and spoke the words that had been written by no identifiable hand. The sermon's argument was unusual. It proposed that forgetting was not merely a failure of memory, but a sin, a deliberate turning away from those who had come before, a betrayal of the dead by the living. "We forget because we wish to forget," the sermon declared. "We bury the past because we cannot bear its weight. But the past does not consent to burial. It waits beneath the surface, patient and watchful, until we remember, or until it forces us to." The congregation listened in silence. When Gould finished, no one spoke. The service concluded without hymn or benediction. The parishioners filed out into the July sunlight, and most of them never spoke of the sermon again. But 3 of them could not stop thinking about it. The 3 parishioners who reported unusual experiences following the sermon were Thomas Gould, who had read it aloud, a young woman named Hannah Currier, who had been seated in the front pew, and an elderly farmer named Josiah Peasley, who had been attending Rocky Hill Meeting House since childhood. All 3 reported the same dream, occurring for 11 consecutive nights, beginning on July 15th. In the dream, they stood in the Rocky Hill Meeting House. The building was empty, no congregation, no minister, no sound. The light through the windows was dim and gray, as if filtered through fog. They walked to the pulpit and found a piece of paper on the lectern, covered with handwriting. When they tried to read it, they could not. The words would not resolve into meaning. They looked at their hands, and their hands were unfamiliar. They tried to remember their own names, and their names would not come. The dream lasted, by their accounts, for an indeterminate period, minutes or hours, they could not say. It ended only when they woke, gasping, with the sensation that something had been standing just behind them, watching them struggle to remember who they were. Gould recorded his experience in a private journal, which was discovered by his descendants in 1912. Currier mentioned hers in a letter to her sister, preserved in a collection at the New Hampshire Historical Society. Peasley spoke of his to the minister who eventually arrived to replace Reverend Morse, and the minister included a brief reference in his own correspondence. None of the 3 discussed the dreams with each other. They did not know until years later that they had shared the same experience. The sermon itself was preserved for a time. Thomas Gould kept the document in his personal papers, intending to include it in the church records. But when he went to retrieve it in August of 1827, he found that the handwriting had faded significantly. By September, the words were barely legible. By October, the page was blank. The ink had not flaked away. The paper had not degraded. The words had simply vanished, as if they had been written in a medium that was never meant to last. Gould made a copy before the text disappeared entirely. His transcription survives in the Amesbury Historical Society archives, the only remaining record of the sermon's content. The original page, now blank, was reportedly buried with Gould when he died in 1843. Researchers have examined the transcription extensively. The theology is orthodox, if somewhat unusual in emphasis. The prose style is formal, consistent with early 19th century preaching. The handwriting in the transcription is Gould's own, unremarkable, verifiable. But no one has ever identified the author of the original. The handwriting matched no known member of the Rocky Hill congregation. no minister who served the region, no individual whose papers have survived from that era. A graphologist consulted in 1978 concluded that the handwriting, based on Gould's description, since the original was long gone, was consistent with someone trained in penmanship in the late 18th century. The letter forms, the spacing, the pressure patterns all suggested a hand that had learned to write in the 1770s or 1780s. By 1827, anyone trained in that era would have been at least 50 years old. Most would have been dead. Rocky Hill Meeting House remains standing, maintained by preservation societies that open it for occasional tours and events. The pulpit is original, the lectern upon which the sermon appeared still in place. Visitors are welcome to touch it, to stand where Thomas Gould stood when he read words that no one had written. The burial ground surrounding the meeting house contains over 200 graves, the oldest dating to 1792. The stones are weathered, the inscriptions often illegible. Many of the names have been forgotten, people who lived, worshipped, and died in this small community, now reduced to faint marks on crumbling slate. The sermon spoke of forgetting as a sin. It spoke of the dead, waiting to be remembered, patient and watchful. It appeared from nowhere, lasted long enough to be read and copied, and then erased itself, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, as if the message had been delivered to those who needed to hear it. Hannah Currier died in 1831, 4 years after the incident. Her gravestone stands in the Rocky Hill burial ground near the southwest corner. The inscription reads, "She remembered." No one knows what the words refer to. Thomas Gould lived until 1843. His stone is near the eastern fence. It bears only his name and dates. No epitaph, no sentiment, nothing to suggest what he had witnessed or what dreams had troubled his sleep for 11 nights in the summer of 1827. Josiah Peaslee outlived them both, dying in 1852 at the age of 87. His descendants reported that he refused to enter the Rocky Hill Meeting House after 1827. He attended services at the new church in Amesbury, walking the extra distance each Sunday, never explaining why. When asked about the sermon, late in his life, he reportedly said only, "Some things are written that we are not meant to read, and some things are forgotten that we were never meant to remember." The lectern stands empty now. The pulpit has not been used for regular services in nearly 2 centuries. But the meeting house waits, as it has always waited, for someone to find what has been left behind. And perhaps, on certain Sundays, when the light is dim and the air is still, something writes again, words that fade before they can be read, messages from those who have not consented to be forgotten. The sin of forgetting. The sermon wrote itself once. Perhaps it is writing still. Registers exist to record the living, but some entries refuse to belong to either world. South Church of Portsmouth stands on State Street, a few blocks from the waterfront that made the city prosperous in the colonial era. The church was founded in 1716 as a congregational parish, one of the earliest established in New Hampshire's only seaport. The original building has been replaced twice, once after a fire in 1861, again after structural concerns in 1912, but the congregation has remained continuous for over 3 centuries, and its records have been preserved with unusual care. The archives of South Church include some of the most complete ecclesiastical documentation in New Hampshire. Birth records, death records, marriage records, membership rolls, disciplinary proceedings, financial accounts. The paper trail is extensive, spanning generations of ministers, deacons, and clerks who understood that documentation was a sacred duty. Among these records is the baptismal register for the period 1740 through 1790, a leather-bound volume approximately 14 inches tall, 10 inches wide, and 3 inches thick. It contains the names of over 2,000 children baptized at South Church during those 50 years, entered chronologically by the ministers and clerks who served the congregation. It also contains something else. Every seventh page of the register includes a name written in the margin, not in the main columns where legitimate entries appear, but in the narrow space between the text block and the edge of the page. The names are always children. They are always listed as stillborn, and they always bear the same date of birth, March 3rd. The year varies, the name varies, the handwriting varies, but the date is always the same, March 3rd. The anomaly was first documented in 1874 by a church historian named Reverend Jonathan Seavey, who was compiling a comprehensive record of South Church baptisms for a commemorative volume. Seavey noticed the marginal entries while transcribing the register and initially assumed they were informal notes, perhaps stillborn children whose parents had requested some acknowledgement, even though unbaptized infants were not typically recorded. But as he continued his work, the pattern became clear. Every seventh page, always the margin, always stillborn, always March 3rd. Seavey counted the entries. He found 37 names spanning the 50-year period of the register. The earliest was dated March 3, 1742. The latest was March 3, 1789. The names were varied: English, Scottish, German, French, reflecting the diverse origins of Portsmouth's colonial population. None of the names appeared in any burial record, none appeared in any death record, none appeared in any other church document. The children existed only in the margins of the baptismal register, recorded by hands that changed over the decades but maintained the same cryptic practice. Seavey included a brief mention of the anomaly in his commemorative volume, describing it as a peculiar custom, possibly reflecting folk beliefs about stillborn children, the origins of which remain obscure. He did not investigate further. Others did. In 1891, a genealogist named Abigail Wendell was researching her family's history in Portsmouth when she encountered the register. Her great-great-grandmother had been baptized at South Church in 1763, and Wendell hoped to find additional family members in the records. She found something else instead. On the page containing her ancestor's baptismal entry, in the margin, was a name she did not recognize: Mercy Wendell, stillborn, March 3, 1763. Wendell had extensive knowledge of her family tree. She knew of no Mercy Wendell, no stillborn child, no infant who had died in 1763. She checked the family Bible that had been passed down through generations. No Mercy was recorded. She checked the burial records of South Church and every other church in Portsmouth. No Mercy Wendell appeared, yet there was the name, written in the margin of the official register, in handwriting that matched the clerk who had recorded the other entries on that page. Wendell attempted to trace the other marginal names. She spent 3 years searching records throughout New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. She found no evidence that any of the 37 children had ever existed. No family records, no gravestones, no references in letters or diaries. She also discovered something Seavey had not noticed. The practice had not ended in 1790. The South Church baptismal register for 1790 through 1840, kept in a separate volume, also contained marginal entries, every 7th page. Always stillborn, always March 3rd, 12 more names, extending the pattern into the 19th century. Wendell published her findings in a small pamphlet in 1894, distributed primarily to local historical societies. The pamphlet attracted little attention. Most readers assumed the entries were a clerical tradition of some kind, a symbolic gesture toward children who had died before baptism, recorded in the margins because they could not be recorded in the main text. But Wendell was not satisfied with this explanation. Symbolic gestures do not span 100 years, she wrote. Symbolic gestures do not change handwriting. Symbolic gestures do not maintain a precise pattern. Every 7th page, always the same date, across generations of record keepers who left no explanation for their actions. Something else is happening here. I do not know what. The most thorough examination of the register was conducted in 1908 by a church archivist named Eleanor Bradstreet. Bradstreet had been hired to catalog and preserve South Church's historical documents, many of which had deteriorated over the centuries. The baptismal registers were a priority, and she spent several months examining them in detail. She confirmed the pattern that Seavey and Wendell had identified. Every seventh page contained a marginal entry. The entries were always children, always stillborn, always dated March 3rd. The handwriting changed over time, matching the known hands of successive clerks, but the practice remained constant. Bradstreet conducted a comprehensive count. She examined every register from 1740 to 1840, 100 years of records. She found 49 names, 49 children recorded in the margins, listed as stillborn on March 3rd in 49 different years. None of them appeared in any other record. None of them had family names that could be traced to actual Portsmouth residents. None of them, as far as Bradstreet could determine, had ever been born at all. She noted her findings in a small notebook that was discovered among her papers after her death in 1953. The notebook contained meticulous documentation of each name, each date, each page number. On the final page, in handwriting that trembled slightly, she had written a single sentence: "I will not count again." She did not explain why. The church records offer no insight into the practice. Meeting minutes from the relevant period make no mention of stillborn children, marginal entries, or special observances on March 3rd. Ministerial correspondence contains no references. Deacons' reports are silent. Whatever the clerks were doing, they did not discuss it in any surviving document. The date itself, March 3rd, has no obvious significance in the Christian calendar. It is not a feast day, not a fast day, not associated with any saint relevant to children or childbirth. It falls in late winter, a season of high infant mortality in colonial New England, but that does not explain why the same date would be used repeatedly across a century of records. Some researchers have proposed that March 3rd might have local significance, a date associated with a particular tragedy, perhaps, or a folk tradition specific to Portsmouth, but no such event or tradition has been identified. In 1972, a professor of religious studies at the University of New Hampshire named Dr. Samuel Treadwell proposed a theory based on numerology. March 3rd is the 62nd day of the year in non-leap years, and 62 is divisible by both 2 and 31. The pattern of every seventh page, he suggested, might relate to the biblical significance of the number 7. But Treadwell admitted that his theory was speculative and could not explain why the practice had been maintained across multiple generations of record keepers. A folklorist named Patricia Healy, writing in 1989, suggested that the entries might represent a form of protective magic, a way of recording children who had never existed in order to prevent real children from dying. Similar practices have been documented in other cultures, where symbolic deaths are recorded to deceive malevolent spirits. But Healy acknowledged that no evidence of such beliefs had been found in colonial Portsmouth. The church itself has declined to comment on the anomaly. Current leadership regards the marginal entries as a historical curiosity, possibly the result of informal record-keeping practices that were common in earlier centuries. Requests to examine the original registers must be approved by a committee, and approval is rarely granted. The registers remain in the church archives, stored in a climate-controlled vault installed in 1985. The marginal entries remain where they have always been, 49 names, written in the narrow space between the text and the edge of the page, recording children who were never baptized because they were never alive, or perhaps they were alive. Perhaps they existed in some way that the official records could not acknowledge. Children who were born and died on March 3rd year after year, whose presence could only be noted in the margins because they did not fit in the main text of existence. Eleanor Bradstreet counted them once. 49 names. She wrote that she would not count again. Her notebook was found in a box of her personal effects, stored in her daughter's attic for over 40 years after her death. The daughter, when asked about the notebook, said her mother had never mentioned the baptismal registers or the marginal entries. She didn't talk about her work much, the daughter said in a 1994 interview. But I remember she had trouble sleeping toward the end of her time at the church. She said she kept dreaming about children, rows of them standing in the church, waiting to be counted. She said they all had the same birthday. The daughter did not know what birthday she meant. The registers sit in their vault, undisturbed except for occasional scholarly inquiries that are usually denied. The church holds services each Sunday, baptizing new children into the faith, recording their names in modern registers that follow modern conventions. No marginal entries have been added since 1840, when the old register ended and new record-keeping practices began. But March 3rd comes every year, as it always has, and somewhere in the margins, in the spaces between what is recorded and what is real, 49 children remain, waiting for someone to count them again, or perhaps waiting for the count to reach 50. A locked door can keep people out, but sometimes it keeps something in. Webster lies in the Merrimack Valley of south-central New Hampshire, a small town of forested hills and narrow roads that has never held more than 2,000 residents. It was incorporated in 1860 under its current name, but the settlement is older, dating back to the mid-18th century, when it was part of the larger town of Boscawen. The terrain is rugged, the winters harsh, the soil thin. The people who settled here were accustomed to isolation. The meeting house at the center of Webster was built in 1793, a modest structure of timber and clapboard on a rise overlooking the town common. It served as the primary gathering place for a community of perhaps 300 souls, farmers, tradesmen, and their families who came together each Sunday to worship and to confirm that they were not alone in the wilderness. In February of 1814, the wilderness reminded them how small they were. The blizzard began on February 7th and did not relent until February 12th. Snow fell continuously for 5 days, driven by winds that piled drifts higher than the roof lines of the smaller houses. Roads became impassable. Families were confined to their homes, burning through their stores of firewood, rationing food, waiting for the storm to end. When it finally did, the silence that followed was almost worse. The sky cleared to a brilliant, pitiless blue. The temperature dropped. The snow lay over Webster like a burial shroud, erasing the familiar contours of the landscape. It took 4 more days until February 16th for the men of the town to dig paths between the scattered homesteads and clear a route to the common. When they reached the meeting house, they found something unexpected. The building was locked from the inside. The discovery was made by a farmer named Ezra Colby, who had been assigned to check the meeting house for storm damage. He trudged through waist-deep snow to the front entrance and found the door would not open. The latch moved freely, but something held the door fast from within. Colby circled the building. The rear door was the same, latched on the outside but immovable, as if barred from within. The windows were shuttered and would not budge. The meeting house was sealed. He summoned other men. They tried the doors again, applied their shoulders, considered breaking a window. Before resorting to that, someone thought to check beneath the building, the crawl space that allowed access for foundation repairs. A young man named Thomas Morrill volunteered to crawl under. He emerged several minutes later, pale and quiet, and reported that the cellar hatch was also secured from inside. The men broke a window. What they found within did not match a building that should have been empty for 9 days. The interior of the meeting house showed clear signs of recent occupation. Candles had been lit, dozens of them, placed on the windowsills, the pulpit, the edges of the pews. The wax had melted and pooled, some of it still soft, as if the candles had been burning within the past day. The iron candle holders were warm to the touch. Footprints marked the dusty floor. The meeting house had not been cleaned since before the storm, and a fine layer of dust had settled on the boards. The footprints were numerous, overlapping, suggesting many people moving about the space. They led from the door to the pews, from the pews to the pulpit, from the pulpit back again, the movements of a congregation assembling for worship. The hymn books had been disturbed. Several lay open on the pews, all turned to page 94. The hymn on that page was, "O God, our help in ages past," a standard selection, unremarkable in itself. But every open hymn book displayed the same page, as if the congregation had been singing together when they departed, or when they vanished. The men searched the building thoroughly. They checked the cellar, the gallery, the small vestry room behind the pulpit. They found no one. The meeting house was empty of people, but full of evidence that people had been there. And on the pulpit, placed precisely at its center, lay the key to the front door. It was wrapped in a handkerchief of white linen, embroidered in one corner with initials, S.W. No one in Webster had those initials. No family in the town records bore a name beginning with W. The selectmen convened an emergency meeting that evening to discuss what had been found. Every household in Webster was accounted for. The storm had been too severe for travel. No one had left their home for 9 days. The roads had been impassable, even to foot traffic. No stranger could have reached the town, and no resident could have reached the meeting house. Yet someone had been inside. The candles were counted. 47 had been lit, corresponding roughly to the number of families in the congregation. The footprints suggested perhaps 50 to 60 individuals, adults and children. The hymn books numbered 12, and all 12 had been opened to the same page. A delegation was sent to interview each household. Had anyone left their home during the storm? Had anyone seen lights in the direction of the meeting house? Had anyone heard singing on the wind? The answers were uniform, no, no, and no. But 2 residents offered accounts that the selectmen chose not to include in their official minutes. The first was an elderly widow named Patience Stickney, who lived alone in a small cottage on the eastern edge of town. She reported that on the night of February 9th, the 3rd night of the storm, she had heard singing. It came from the direction of the common, she told the delegation. Hymn singing, clear as Sunday morning. I thought I was dreaming, or that my mind was going from the loneliness, but I heard it plain, "O God, our help in ages past." I know that hymn. I've sung it all my life. She had not investigated. The storm was too severe, and she was too old. She had listened until the singing faded, then returned to her bed and tried to convince herself she had imagined it. The second account came from a young boy named Samuel Prescott, age 11, who had been confined with his family in their farmhouse on the northern road. Samuel reported seeing lights through the storm, faint flickering glows in the direction of the meeting house, visible through the driving snow. They looked like candles, he told his father, who relayed the account to the selectmen. Lots of them, moving around inside the windows. I watched for a long time. Then they went out, all at once. His father had dismissed the sighting as a trick of the storm, the boy's imagination inflamed by boredom and isolation. But Samuel maintained his account consistently, even when pressed. Neither Patience Stickney nor Samuel Prescott could explain what they had witnessed. Neither had any connection to the initials S.W. Neither could identify who might have gathered in the meeting house during the worst blizzard in living memory. The selectmen's official report, filed in March of 1814, concluded that the meeting house had been entered by persons unknown during the storm, and that the manner of their entry and departure could not be determined. The report recommended that a new lock be installed and that the building be inspected regularly during periods of severe weather. The report did not speculate on who the persons might have been, how they had reached the meeting house through impassable snow, or why they had locked themselves inside. The handkerchief with the initials S.W. was preserved in the church records, where it remained until 1897, when it was transferred to the Webster Historical Society. A researcher who examined it in 1934 noted that the embroidery style was consistent with late 18th century needlework, older than the storm itself, perhaps by 20 or 30 years. The key was returned to normal use, though several subsequent sextons reported that it occasionally felt warm to the touch, even in winter. The hymn books remained in the meeting house for another 40 years until they were replaced during a renovation in 1856. A church member who helped dispose of the old books noted that the copies of O God, Our Help in Ages Past, on page 94, were more worn than the surrounding pages, the paper softer, the ink more faded, as if that particular hymn had been sung many more times than the others. The meeting house was torn down in 1891, replaced by a new church building on a different site. The lumber was sold for salvage. The location is now a small park with a historical marker that makes no mention of the events of February 1814. But local historians have continued to investigate the incident, drawn by its stubborn refusal to yield a rational explanation. In 1967, a researcher named Howard Emerson attempted to identify any family with the initials S.W. who might have had a connection to Webster or the surrounding region. He searched records from Boscawen, Concord, Hopkinton, and a dozen other towns. He found no match. He did, however, find a reference in the Boscawen church records to a family named Whitmore, who had lived in the area in the 1760s before the Webster settlement was established. The family had included a daughter named Sarah Whitmore, initials S.W. Sarah Whitmore had died in 1768 at the age of 19. She had been engaged to be married. She had been a member of the Boscawen congregation. The cause of her death was listed as exposure during storm. Emerson could not establish any direct connection between Sarah Whitmore and the 1814 incident. The dates were separated by nearly 50 years. The locations were different. The handkerchief might have been a coincidence, the initials common, the embroidery style unremarkable. But he noted in his research journal a detail that he found difficult to dismiss. Sarah Whitmore had been buried in the old Boscawen Cemetery, less than 2 miles from the site of the Webster Meeting House. Her gravestone had been recorded in an 1820 survey of the cemetery. The stone was no longer there. By 1860, it had vanished, not toppled, not broken, but simply gone, as if it had never existed. The survey had recorded the inscription, Sarah Whitmore, 1749 to 1768. She waited for the congregation to gather. The Webster Meeting House no longer stands. The park where it once stood is quiet, shaded by old maples, visited occasionally by families with children or dog walkers who do not know what happened there. The handkerchief remains in the Historical Society's collection, preserved in acid-free paper, rarely examined. The initials are still visible, S.W., embroidered in thread that has faded from white to ivory but has not decayed. The key was lost sometime in the early 20th century. No one knows what became of it. And every February, when the snow lies deep and the wind howls through the valley, some residents of Webster claim to hear singing on the coldest nights, faint, distant, carried on the wind from the direction of the old common. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. A congregation gathering in a locked room, waiting out a storm that ended 2 centuries ago, or perhaps waiting for something else entirely. The door was locked from the inside, the key was on the pulpit, and everyone in town was accounted for, everyone who was still alive. Some architecture does not serve the living. It waits for something else. Claremont sits on the western edge of New Hampshire, along the Connecticut River that marks the border with Vermont. It is the largest town in Sullivan County, a former mill city that prospered in the 19th century and declined in the 20th, leaving behind a downtown of handsome brick buildings and churches that speak of an earlier confidence. The town was settled in the 1760s and incorporated in 1764, drawing residents from Connecticut and Massachusetts who sought land and opportunity in the Upper Valley. Union Church stands on Broad Street, near the center of the Old Town, a white clapboard structure with a traditional New England steeple that has defined the Claremont skyline for over 2 centuries. The church was built in 1792 to serve a Congregationalist parish that had outgrown its original meeting house. It was designed in the Federal style, simple and elegant, with clear glass windows, wooden pews, and a raised pulpit at the front of the sanctuary. It has always been a Protestant church. Congregationalism emerged from the Puritan tradition of New England, emphasizing individual conscience, congregational governance, and the rejection of Catholic ritual. The denomination has no confession, no absolution, no priest to mediate between the believer and God. Yet the eastern wall of Union Church contains a confessional window. The window is approximately 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall, set into the wall at roughly head height. It is covered by a wooden panel, hinged at the top, that can be lifted to reveal a small opening. On the other side of the wall is a narrow closet, barely 3 feet wide, that has no door, no other entrance, and no apparent purpose. The window faces the closet faces nothing. Architectural historians have examined the church repeatedly over the past century. All agree that the window and closet are original features built in 1792, part of the initial construction. All agree that they serve no function in Congregationalist worship. None can explain why they are there. The first recorded inquiry into the confessional window occurred in 1847 when a new minister named Reverend Amos Whitcomb arrived at Union Church and began reviewing the building's history. Whitcomb was troubled by the window. He had trained at Andover Theological Seminary and was well versed in church architecture. He recognized the confessional design immediately, the small opening, the hinged panel, the arrangement that allowed a penitent to speak to an unseen listener. It was unmistakably Catholic in form. He wrote to the denominational office in Boston asking if any record existed of the church's original construction. The reply was unhelpful. The architect was unknown, the construction records had been lost in a fire in 1809, and no living member of the congregation could explain the window's presence. Whitcomb interviewed elderly parishioners, some of whom had attended Union Church since childhood. Several remembered the window, but had never thought to question it. One woman, in her 80s, recalled that her grandmother had warned her never to approach the eastern wall alone. "She said something lived in that closet," the woman told Whitcomb, "something that wanted to hear our sins. She said the window was there so it could listen." Whitcomb dismissed this as superstition. He proposed to the church board that the window be permanently sealed and the closet converted to storage. The board agreed in principle, but never allocated funds for the work. The window remained. For the next century, the confessional window was largely ignored, a curiosity noted by occasional visitors, but never investigated seriously. Then, in 1956, the church undertook a major renovation. The roof needed replacement, the foundation required repair, and the eastern wall had developed cracks that threatened the structure's integrity. A contractor from Lebanon, New Hampshire, named Gerald Fontaine, was hired to oversee the work. Fontaine was a practical man, a veteran of the construction trade with no particular interest in local history or church architecture. He began work in March of that year, focusing first on the foundation and working upward. By May, his crew had reached the eastern wall. On May 14th, Fontaine was working alone near the confessional window, assessing the extent of the plaster damage, when he heard something. A voice. It came from behind the sealed panel, faint, clear, and unmistakably human. The voice asked a single question: "Are you ready to tell them?" Fontaine documented the incident in his daily work log, which was later obtained by researchers through the church archives. His entry reads, "Heard voice from sealed window, east wall. Asked question about telling them. No one in building but me. Checked closet, empty, no access. Cannot explain. Will not work on east wall alone." He reported the incident to the church board. They assured him the building was empty, that the voice must have been a trick of acoustics, that old buildings made strange sounds. Fontaine was unconvinced. He refused to complete the work on the eastern wall. He finished the roof and foundation repairs, submitted his final invoice, and never returned to Union Church. His log contained a final note on the subject. "Whatever is behind that window, it knows something. It wants me to tell. I don't know what. I don't want to know." The church hired another contractor to complete the eastern wall repairs. His name was Robert Desrosiers, a mason from Claremont itself, recommended by a member of the congregation. Desrosiers worked on the wall for 3 days in June of 1956. On the third day, he submitted a letter of resignation to the church board. The letter, preserved in the church files, reads, "I cannot continue work on the east wall. On the afternoon of June 12th, I was repairing plaster near the sealed window when I heard a voice from behind the panel. The voice asked, 'Are you ready to tell them?' I did not answer. I left the building and will not return. I recommend the window be left alone. I believe something is waiting there." The church board was disturbed by the similarity between Desrosiers' account and Fontaine's. They contacted a third contractor, a firm from Keene named Hobart and Sons, and carefully avoided mentioning the previous incidents. The Hobart crew worked on the eastern wall for 1 day, July 2, 1956, before the foreman, a man named Earl Phelps, halted operations. His incident report, filed with the company office, states, "While examining the sealed window on the east wall, I heard a voice from the other side. It asked, 'Are you ready to tell them?' I checked the closet behind the window. It was empty. The window has no opening, no gap, no way for sound to pass through. I cannot explain how I heard what I heard. I recommend no further work on the east wall until the matter is investigated." Hobart and Sons withdrew from the project. The eastern wall was patched superficially, the structural cracks stabilized, but not fully repaired. The confessional window remained sealed. The church has not attempted major renovations on the eastern wall since 1956. Minor repairs have been conducted over the years, always by workers who were not informed of the window's history. In 1978, an electrician named Thomas Krajewski reported hearing a muffled voice while running wiring near the eastern wall. He did not document the exact words, but told the church sexton that it sounded like a question. In 1993, a painter named Sandra Beliveau heard what she described as someone whispering behind the sealed panel. She asked the minister if anyone else was in the building. He assured her the church was empty. She finished her work but later told friends that she had felt watched the entire time. In 2011, a building inspector conducting a routine assessment noted the confessional window in his report and asked about its purpose. The church provided no explanation. The inspector wrote, "Sealed window on east wall appears to be original construction, function unknown, no structural concerns." He did not mention hearing anything unusual. Perhaps he did not approach closely enough. Perhaps the voice only speaks to those who might be able to answer its question. Researchers have proposed various explanations for the confessional window's existence. One theory suggests that the original architect of Union Church may have been Catholic, a closeted adherent of the old faith who incorporated the window as a secret tribute to the sacraments he could not practice openly. But this theory has no supporting evidence, and the window's prominent position on the eastern wall would have made it a poor candidate for concealment. Another theory proposes that the window was intended for some Protestant purpose that has since been forgotten, perhaps a form of private spiritual counseling that never became established practice. But no Congregationalist tradition includes anything resembling confession, and no other New England church of the period contains a similar feature. A third theory, advanced by a folklorist in 1987, suggests that the window may be connected to local superstitions about unburdening guilt to supernatural entities. Some New England communities maintained beliefs in household spirits or guardian presences that could be consulted through ritual objects. The confessional window in this interpretation might have been built to satisfy folk practices that the congregation officially rejected but privately maintained. None of these theories explain the voice. The closet behind the confessional window has been examined multiple times. It measures approximately 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 8 feet tall. The walls are original plaster over lath. The floor is bare wood. There is no door, no entrance except the small window. A person would have to be sealed inside during construction to occupy the space. A building historian named Dr. Eleanor Vance examined the closet in 2004 with permission from the church board. She found no evidence of modification, no hidden passages, no acoustic anomalies that might explain how sound could travel through the sealed panel. The wood of the panel was solid white pine, over 2 inches thick, without gaps or cracks. There is no rational mechanism by which a voice could be heard through this window, Vance wrote in her assessment. The panel is sealed. The closet is empty. Yet 4 independent witnesses over a span of 50 years have reported hearing the same question. I have no explanation for this. She did not attempt to open the panel. The church board had requested that it remain sealed. Whatever is behind that window, the board chair told her, we'd rather not know. Union Church continues to hold services every Sunday. The eastern wall has been repainted, the cracks patched, the confessional window undisturbed. Most current members of the congregation do not know its history. Those who do tend not to discuss it. The sealed panel remains in place, hinged at the top, designed to lift and reveal the opening beneath. No one has lifted it in living memory. No one knows what would happen if they did. The question, are you ready to tell them, implies a confession waiting to be made. It implies secrets that have not been spoken. It implies a listener who has been waiting since 1792 for someone to answer. Gerald Fontaine died in 1989. Robert Desrosiers died in 2001. Earl Phelps died in 1997. None of them ever explained what they might have been expected to tell, or to whom. The voice, if it still speaks, has not been heard since 1993, or at least no one has reported hearing it. Perhaps no one has worked close enough to the window. Perhaps no one has been listening, or perhaps the voice is waiting for the right person. The one who knows what needs to be told, the one who is ready to lift the panel and speak into the darkness of the empty closet. The window is still there. The question is still waiting. And somewhere behind 2 inches of white pine, in a space that has no door and no entrance, something continues to listen for an answer that has never come. Stairs are meant to be counted. They are meant to stay the same number in both directions. Sandwich is a small town in the foothills of the White Mountains, nestled in the lake region of central New Hampshire, where the terrain begins its slow rise toward the Presidential Range. The town was incorporated in 1763 and named for the Earl of Sandwich, a colonial patron whose connection to the area was purely administrative. The settlement grew slowly, sustained by subsistence farming and the timber trade, never exceeding a few thousand residents, even at its peak. First Church of Sandwich stands on Main Street, a white clapboard structure with a modest steeple that has anchored the town common since 1841. The original meeting house, built in 1791, had deteriorated beyond repair, and the congregation voted to construct a new building on the same site. The architect was a local man named Josiah Bede, who had designed several other churches in the region. His plans called for a traditional New England interior, box pews, clear glass windows, a gallery for the choir, and a raised pulpit at the front of the sanctuary. The pulpit was elevated approximately 4 feet above the sanctuary floor, accessed by a short staircase on the left side. Bede's original plans, preserved in the Town Historical Society, clearly show 6 steps. The stairs were built according to specification. The wood was white oak, the treads were 10 inches deep, the risers were 7 inches high. The staircase was inspected upon completion and found to conform to the architect's design. 6 steps. But from the very first Sunday service in the new building, something was wrong. The first minister to serve in the new First Church was Reverend Caleb Morton, who had led the congregation since 1832. Morton was 63 years old in 1841, a man of precise habits and careful observation, who had kept a detailed journal throughout his ministry. His entry for September 19, 1841, the first Sunday in the new church, includes an unusual observation. Ascended the pulpit stairs this morning and counted 7 steps, though I am certain Mr. Bede's plans called for 6. Descended after the service and counted only 6. I must have miscounted in my nervousness. The new building is unfamiliar, and I was anxious about the dedication sermon. Morton made the same observation the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. By October, he had stopped attributing the discrepancy to nervousness. His journal entries become increasingly troubled. October 3, 7 steps ascending, 6 descending. I have counted carefully each time. I am not mistaken. October 17, asked Deacon Philbrick to count the steps while I watched. He counted 6. I ascended immediately after and counted 7. The same stairs, the same moment, different numbers. November 7th. I have begun to dread the ascent. The 7th step feels different, not in texture or height, but in some quality I cannot name. It is as if, for one brief moment, I am somewhere else, somewhere that is not the church. The sensation passes before I can examine it. Morton served First Church until his death in 1854. His journals make no further mention of the stairs after November of 1841. Whether he made peace with the anomaly or simply chose not to document it, no one knows. Morton's successor, Reverend Thomas Eastman, served from 1854 to 1879. His personal papers, donated to the New Hampshire Historical Society after his death, include a single reference to the pulpit stairs. In a letter to a seminary classmate dated March of 1856, Eastman wrote, "You asked how I find my new congregation. The people are kind, the building is handsome, and the work is fulfilling. But there is one peculiarity I cannot explain. The pulpit stairs number 6 by every measurement, yet I count 7 each time I ascend. My predecessor left no mention of this in the church records, and I have not raised it with the deacons. I fear they would think me unwell. But I count 7 every Sunday as surely as I count the commandments. And on that 7th step I feel something I cannot describe, a presence, perhaps, or an absence, a moment when I am not entirely in the church. It passes quickly. I do not know what it means." Eastman's letter suggests that Morton had not warned his successor about the stairs. Each minister, it seems, discovered the anomaly independently. The pattern continued. Between 1841 and 1989, First Church of Sandwich was served by 14 ministers. Church historians have examined the surviving papers of 11 of them. 8 made explicit reference to the pulpit stairs. Reverend William Holt, 1879 to 1897, wrote in his journal, "The 7th step is real. I feel it beneath my foot, but it does not exist when I look for it." Reverend Charles Goodwin, 1897 to 1912, mentioned the stairs in a letter to his wife during a period of marital separation. You asked what troubles me about the church. It is not the congregation, not the salary, not the cold winters. It is the stairs. 7 up, 6 down. Every Sunday for 15 years. I have never told anyone. Reverend James Aldrich, 1923 to 1941, attempted a systematic investigation. His notes, preserved in the church archives, document over 50 attempts to identify the discrepancy. He measured the stairs with a tape measure, 6 steps. He photographed them, 6 steps. He had a carpenter examine them, 6 steps. He counted while ascending, 7 steps. The 7th step is not visible, Aldrich wrote. It is not measurable. It cannot be photographed or touched by anyone standing outside the staircase. But it is there. I climb it every Sunday. And for one moment during that step, I am not in the church. I am somewhere else, somewhere dark and quiet, where I cannot see the congregation, where I cannot hear the organ. Then I am on the 6th step, at the top, and the moment has passed. Aldrich retired in 1941, exactly 100 years after the church was built. He never spoke publicly about the stairs. The most thorough investigation was conducted in 1989 by a visiting minister named Reverend David Okonkwo. Okonkwo was a Presbyterian minister from Boston who had agreed to serve First Church for 2 years while the congregation searched for a permanent pastor. He was 47 years old, educated at Princeton Theological Seminary, and had spent most of his career in urban parishes where mysteries were social rather than architectural. He noticed the discrepancy on his first Sunday, 7 steps up, 6 steps down. Unlike his predecessors, Okonkwo approached the problem empirically. He borrowed a pedometer, a mechanical step counter worn on the shoe, from a parishioner who used it for exercise. He calibrated the device carefully, testing it on stairs of known dimensions. On Sunday, March 5, 1989, he wore the pedometer while ascending the pulpit stairs. The device registered 7 steps. He descended after the service. The device registered 6 additional steps. He repeated the experiment the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. The results were consistent. The mechanical counter, incapable of imagination or error, recorded 7 steps ascending and 6 steps descending. Okonkwo documented his findings in a written reflection that he submitted to the church archives before his departure in 1991. The document runs to 12 pages, mostly technical analysis of the staircase construction, acoustic measurements, and attempts to identify hidden mechanisms. The final paragraph is personal. I do not know where I go on that 7th step. I only know I have been going there for 2 years. The step is real. The counter proves that. But it exists only during the ascent, only for me, and only for a fraction of a second. In that fraction, I am somewhere else. Not heaven, not hell, not any place I recognize. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that has been waiting. I do not know who built that step or why. I know only that every minister who climbs these stairs has been visiting the same place Sunday after Sunday for 150 years, and I suspect they will continue to visit it long after I am gone. Structural engineers have examined the pulpit stairs on 3 occasions, 1952, 1978, and 2004. All 3 surveys reached the same conclusion. The staircase contains 6 steps, constructed of white oak, conforming to the original 1841 plans. Photographs of the stairs, and there are dozens spanning over a century, consistently show 6 steps. Video recordings show 6 steps. Laser measurements show 6 steps. No physical evidence supports the existence of a 7th step. Yet the testimony of the ministers is remarkably consistent. 7 steps ascending, 6 steps descending. A moment of transition on the 7th step. A darkness, a silence, a sense of being elsewhere. A psychologist consulted in 1993 proposed that the phenomenon might be a form of dissociation triggered by the ritual significance of ascending the pulpit. The minister, preparing to speak on behalf of God, might unconsciously add a step to mark the transition from ordinary space to sacred space. But this theory does not explain the pedometer. Mechanical devices do not dissociate. A physicist at Dartmouth College, asked to comment on the case in 2007, suggested that the staircase might occupy a space of slightly unusual geometry, a region where the rules of measurement break down in subtle ways. He acknowledged that this explanation was speculative and probably untestable. If there is a seventh step, he said, it exists in a way that our instruments cannot detect, but our bodies can. That is not impossible. It is merely inexplicable. First Church of Sandwich continues to hold services every Sunday. The current minister, Reverend Sarah Lindquist, has served since 2018. When asked about the pulpit stairs, she smiles and changes the subject. Her predecessor, Reverend Michael Thorne, served from 2004 to 2017. In a 2015 interview with a regional newspaper about the church's history, he was asked about local legends. "There are stories about the stairs," he said. "Every old church has stories. I don't put much stock in them." The interviewer asked if he had ever noticed anything unusual about the pulpit stairs. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "I count 7 steps going up," he said finally. 6 coming down. I've stopped trying to explain it. I just accept it as part of the job." He did not elaborate on what happened during the 7th step. He did not describe where he went or what he felt. Perhaps after 13 years, it had become too familiar to describe, a weekly journey to a place that exists only for those who climb toward the pulpit, only during the ascent, only for a single step that should not be there. The stairs remain, 6 steps in every photograph, every measurement, every structural survey. 7 steps for every minister who climbs them, week after week, year after year, ascending toward a pulpit that requires them to pass through somewhere else before they can speak to their congregation. The 7th step is waiting. It has been waiting since 1841, and whoever designed it, Josiah Bede, or something that guided his hand, left no explanation for what it is, or where it leads, or why every minister must visit that silent darkness before they can deliver the Word of God. Weather vanes are meant to follow the wind. This one followed something else. New Boston lies in the hills of southern New Hampshire, approximately 20 miles west of Manchester, a town of winding roads and forested ridges that has maintained its rural character for over 2.5 centuries. It was settled in the 1730s and incorporated in 1763, drawing families from Massachusetts who sought land and independence in the New Hampshire grants. The town grew slowly, sustained by farming and small industry, never exceeding a few thousand residents. The meeting house at the center of New Boston was built in 1776, the same year the colonies declared their independence from Britain. It was a modest structure, timber-framed with clapboard siding, topped by a small steeple that held a bell for calling the congregation to worship. Atop the steeple, as was customary, sat a weather vane, a simple copper arrow, handcrafted by a local blacksmith, designed to pivot with the wind and indicate its direction. The weather vane was functional and unremarkable. For its first 34 years, it performed exactly as expected, turning with the prevailing winds, pointing north in winter storms and southwest in summer squalls. The townspeople glanced at it occasionally to gauge the weather. No one thought it worthy of special attention. Then, in 1810, a town clerk named Ephraim Dodge noticed something strange. Dodge was a meticulous man, responsible for maintaining the town's official records, births, deaths, marriages, property transfers, tax assessments. He was also an amateur naturalist who kept detailed observations of weather patterns, recording wind direction, temperature, and precipitation in a journal he maintained for over 40 years. In the spring of 1810, Dodge was reviewing his weather records when he noticed a discrepancy. On March 14th, he had recorded a strong wind from the northeast. But his notes also indicated that the meeting house weather vane had been pointing southeast. toward the Hadley farm on the edge of town. Dodge assumed he had made an error. He continued his observations. On April 2nd, he recorded a westerly wind. The weather vane pointed north, toward the Colburn homestead. On April 19th, a southerly wind. The weather vane pointed east, toward the Bradford property. Each time, the weather vane's direction contradicted the actual wind. Dodge began to wonder if the mechanism had become stuck or damaged. He asked a deacon to inspect the steeple. The deacon reported that the weather vane turned freely, responding to the slightest breeze. But it was not responding to the breeze. It was pointing somewhere specific, and then the deaths began. On April 21st, 1810, 2 days after Dodge noted the weather vane pointing east, Nathaniel Bradford died of a sudden fever. He was 53 years old, a lifelong member of the congregation, in apparent good health until the day he fell ill. Dodge did not immediately connect the death to his weather observations, but he continued recording. On May 6th, the weather vane pointed northwest. On May 9th, Rebecca Sweat died in childbirth. She had lived in the northwest corner of town. On May 28th, the weather vane pointed south. On June 1st, Thomas Emery was killed when his horse threw him. He had lived on the southern road. Dodge began to suspect a pattern. He reviewed his records from March. The Hadley farm, where the weather vane had pointed on March 14th, old Samuel Hadley had died on March 17th, 3 days later. The Colburn homestead indicated on April 2nd, young Martha Colburn had succumbed to consumption on April 5th. 11 deaths. 11 times the weather vane had pointed away from the wind and toward a specific house. 11 times, within days, someone in that house had died. Dodge documented his findings in a private memorandum dated June 15, 1810. He did not share it with the congregation. He did not know what to do with the information. "The weather vane does not follow the wind," he wrote. "It follows death. Or perhaps it precedes death, pointing to where death will arrive before death knows its own destination. I cannot explain this. I do not wish to explain it. I wish only to record it, so that someone someday may understand what I have witnessed." Dodge continued his observations for another 32 years, until his own death in 1842. His journals, preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to the New Boston Historical Society, document over 100 instances of the weather vane pointing toward a house where death soon followed. The correlation was not perfect. Occasionally the weather vane pointed in a direction where no death occurred within the expected time frame. Occasionally a congregation member died without the weather vane having indicated their home. But the pattern was consistent enough to be disturbing. Approximately 80% of deaths among congregation members were preceded by the weather vane pointing toward their residence, typically 1 to 5 days before the death occurred. Dodge shared his findings with only one person, his successor as town clerk, a younger man named Hiram Ballard. Ballard was skeptical at first, but began his own observations in 1843. His records, also preserved, confirm the pattern. "The weather vane turned toward the Morrison farm on October 12th, Ballard wrote in 1847. Wind was from the south. Weather vane pointed north. Joseph Morrison died October 15th of injuries sustained in a logging accident. I have now documented 23 such instances. The phenomenon is real." Ballard served as town clerk until 1871. His successor, and the successor after that, continued the practice of recording the weather vane's direction alongside the official death records. By 1900, the documentation spanned nearly a century. The weather vane's predictive accuracy became an open secret among certain families in New Boston, those whose ancestors had served as town clerks or church deacons, those who had access to the records and understood what they meant. Some parishioners began watching the steeple with anxious eyes, noting which direction the arrow pointed after Sunday services. If it pointed toward their home, they would spend the following days in quiet dread, waiting to see who would fall ill, who would suffer an accident, who would simply fail to wake one morning. Others refused to look at the weather vane at all. In 1908, a minister named Reverend Charles Woodbury proposed that the weather vane be removed. He had learned of the records from a deacon whose family had kept the secret for 3 generations. Woodbury was a rational man, educated at Dartmouth College, skeptical of superstition, but he could not dismiss 98 years of documentation. Whatever mechanism governs this object, he wrote in a letter to the church board, it serves no godly purpose. It causes fear among those who understand its nature. It mocks our faith in divine providence by suggesting that death can be predicted by a copper arrow. I recommend its removal and destruction. The board debated the proposal for several months. Some members argued that the weather vane was a historical artifact that should be preserved. Others agreed with Woodbury that it should be destroyed. A few suggested that its removal might somehow make things worse, that the weather vane might be containing something, not causing it. In the end, a compromise was reached. The weather vane would be removed but not destroyed. It would be stored in the church cellar out of sight, where it could cause no further anxiety. On April 3, 1923, workers climbed the steeple and took down the copper arrow. It was wrapped in canvas and placed in a wooden crate in the cellar of the meeting house. For the next 48 years, New Boston had no weather vane. The deaths continued, of course. People died as they always had, of illness, accident, old age. Without the weather vane, there was no warning, no ominous arrow pointing toward the next house to be visited by grief. Some found this a relief. Others felt strangely unmoored, as if an ancient sentinel had abandoned its post. The town clerk continued to record deaths, but no longer noted the weather vane's direction. The records from 1923 onward are ordinary, names, dates, causes of death, with no correlation to any external indicator. In 1971, the New Boston Historical Society undertook a restoration of the Colonial Meeting House. The building had deteriorated over the decades, and a preservation committee was formed to return it to its original appearance. They consulted old photographs, architectural records, and town documents. They discovered that the meeting house had once had a weather vane. The committee searched the building and found the wooden crate in the cellar, still wrapped in canvas, undisturbed for nearly 50 years. They were delighted, an original artifact, contemporary with the building's construction, perfectly preserved. No one on the committee knew the weather vane's history. No one had read Ephraim Dodge's journals or Hiram Ballard's records. No one understood why the object had been removed, or why it had been hidden rather than displayed. On September 12, 1971, the weather vane was reinstalled atop the meeting house steeple. The current town clerk of New Boston, a woman named Margaret Holloway, took office in 2008. She is the first clerk in nearly a century to be aware of the weather vane's history. She discovered the old records while digitizing historical documents for the town's archives, Dodge's journals, Ballard's notes, the correspondence between Reverend Woodbury and the church board. She read them with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Then she began her own observations. "I don't want to believe it," she said in a 2019 interview with a regional historical magazine. "I'm a rational person. I have a degree in public administration. I don't believe in omens or curses or supernatural weather vanes." She paused. "But I've been watching, and I've been keeping records, and in 11 years I've documented 37 deaths in the congregation. 31 of them were preceded by the weather vane pointing toward the deceased's home, typically 2 to 4 days before." She was asked if she had shared this information with anyone. "No," she said. "What would I say? Don't look at the weather vane because it might be pointing at your house? That would cause panic. It would cause people to leave the church. And it wouldn't change anything. People would still die. The weather vane would still point." She was asked if she had considered having it removed again. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but then I think about those 48 years when it was in the cellar, People still died. The weather vane wasn't pointing anywhere, but death still came. At least now we have warning. Or I do. I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse. The weather vane remains atop the new Boston Meeting House, a simple copper arrow that has turned in the New Hampshire wind for nearly 250 years. On most days, it points in the direction the wind is blowing, as weather vanes do. It follows the storms from the northwest, the summer breezes from the south, the cold fronts that sweep down from Canada. But sometimes, on still days when the wind is calm, the arrow turns. It points toward a house on the edge of town, or a farm in the valley, or a cottage on the hillside. It points with the quiet certainty of something that knows what is coming. The congregation does not speak of it. Most members are unaware of the history. They glance at the steeple occasionally, note the weather, and continue with their lives. Margaret Holloway watches more carefully. She records the weather vane's direction in a notebook she keeps in her desk drawer, alongside the official death records. She has not told anyone what the correlation means. She does not look at the steeple when she leaves church on Sunday mornings. She does not want to know which direction the arrow is pointing. But sometimes, late at night, she wonders if it is pointing toward her house. And she wonders if it is, whether knowing would make any difference at all. Hymnals are printed by the thousands, each copy identical, but one copy is not like the others. The church on the hill stands on Main Street in Lenox, Massachusetts, near the border where the Berkshires rise toward southern Vermont and New Hampshire. The church was built in 1805, a Federal-style meeting house with a towering white steeple that has served as a landmark for travelers through the valley for over 2 centuries. The congregation has always drawn from a wide region, including families from the hill towns that straddle the state lines, communities too small to support their own churches, too remote to travel elsewhere. The church's interior is traditional New England: white walls, clear glass windows, wooden pews arranged in rows facing a raised pulpit. The hymnals are kept in racks on the back of each pew, available for congregants to use during services. Most are modern additions, replaced every few decades as bindings wear and pages loosen. But in the third pew from the back, on the left side of the center aisle, there is an older hymnal. The book is a copy of Hymns of Faith and Devotion, published in 1887 by the American Tract Society. The church purchased 200 copies that year, part of a standard order distributed to congregational churches throughout New England. The edition contains 312 hymns, indexed by title and first line, with musical notation for each. This particular copy contains 313. The extra hymn appears on pages 247 and 248, between Rock of Ages and Safely Through Another Week. It is titled, When We Were Many. No author is credited, no composer is listed for the melody. The hymn consists of 4 verses. When we were many, we did sing with voices raised as one. The rafters held our harmony until the song was done. When we were fewer, still we praised, though seats stood bare and cold. The echo answered back to us the hymns we sang of old. When we were scarcely more than none, we whispered in the night. The church stood hollow, save for us, who kept the fading light. When we are gone, who then shall sing? What voice shall fill the air? The hymnal holds the words we leave for those who are not there. The melody, written in standard notation, is in a minor key, unusual for a hymn of its apparent era. The tune is simple, almost austere, with a descending pattern in the final line of each verse that gives the song a quality of quiet resignation. No other copy of Hymns of Faith and Devotion contains this hymn. No other edition from any publisher includes it. The American Tract Society has no record of it in their archives. It appears in no index, no catalog, no collection of sacred music from any period. It exists only in this one book, in this one church, in the third pew from the back. The hymn was first noticed in 1963 by a choir director named Ruth Callahan, who was cataloging the church's musical holdings. She found the old hymnal while checking pew racks and was intrigued by its age. When she examined the contents, she discovered the extra song. Callahan assumed it was a misprint, perhaps a hymn from a different edition that had been accidentally included, or a local composition that someone had inserted into the book. She checked the binding and found no evidence of added pages. The paper, the typography, and the printing were identical to the surrounding hymns. When We Were Many appeared to have been printed with the rest of the book. She contacted the American Tract Society. They had no record of the hymn and could not explain its presence. She contacted hymnologists at several seminaries. None had heard of the song. She contacted collectors of antique hymnals. None had seen it in any other copy of the 1887 edition. Callahan documented her findings in a letter to the church board, recommending that the hymnal be preserved as a curiosity. The board agreed. The book was removed from the pew rack and placed in a protective case in the church office, where it remained for nearly 4 decades. In 2002, a musicologist named Dr. Evelyn Marsden learned of the hymnal while researching regional variations in American sacred music. She traveled to Lenox to examine the book and was immediately struck by the hymn's unusual character. "The lyrics are not typical of 19th century hymnody," she wrote in her research notes. "The imagery is melancholic, even morbid, a congregation dwindling to nothing, leaving behind only words for those who are not there." The melody reinforces this tone. It is not a hymn of praise or comfort. It is a hymn of ending. Marsden photographed the pages and began searching for parallels in other sources. She found nothing in published hymnals, nothing in manuscript collections, nothing in the archives of any church or denomination. Then she found it somewhere else entirely. In 2003, Marsden was examining documents at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, as part of unrelated research into colonial maritime history. Among the collections was a ship's log recovered from the wreck of the Providence, a merchant vessel that sank off Cape Ann in 1791. The log was fragmentary, damaged by water and age, but portions remained legible. Most entries were routine: cargo manifests, weather observations, navigational notes. But in the margins of one page, someone had written text that was not part of the ship's business. It was a hymn. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but Marsden recognized the words immediately. They were identical to the hymn in the Lenox hymnal. The same 4 verses, the same imagery, the same title, "When We Were Many." Below the text, in the same hand, was musical notation. The melody matched exactly. The log entry was dated October of 1791, 96 years before the Lenox hymnal was published. The Providence was a cargo ship operating between Boston and ports in the Caribbean. Her crew consisted of 14 men, none of whom had any documented connection to churches in Lenox, Massachusetts, or anywhere in the Berkshire region. The ship's manifest listed sugar, molasses, and rum as her primary cargo. There was no indication that she carried passengers, religious materials, or anything that might explain the presence of a hymn in her log. The log's author was the ship's first mate, a man named Cornelius Thorne. Little is known about Thorne beyond the basic facts recorded in maritime documents. He was born in Marblehead in 1758, served on various merchant vessels, and was lost when the Providence went down in a storm. The hymn is the only personal writing attributed to him. It appears in the margin of an otherwise routine page, as if written during idle hours, with no explanation of its origin or purpose. Marsden could not determine whether Thorne had composed the hymn himself or copied it from some other source. She searched for references to "When We Were Many" in 18th century documents, letters, diaries, church records, newspapers, and found nothing. The hymn existed in 2 places: a ship's log from 1791 and a printed hymnal from 1887. The ship had no connection to the church. The church had no connection to the ship. The crew of the Providence had all drowned nearly a century before the hymnal was published. Yet the words were identical, the melody was identical, the title was identical. Marsden published her findings in a 2005 article in a Journal of American Musicology. The article attracted modest attention among specialists, but offered no explanation for the hymn's dual existence. The most likely explanation, Marsden wrote, is that the hymn circulated orally among certain communities in New England during the late 18th century, was written down by Cornelius Thorne in 1791, and was later included, by unknown means, in a single copy of an 1887 hymnal. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Why does the hymn appear in no other source? Why was it included in only one copy of the hymnal? How did a song about a dying congregation come to be written by a sailor on a merchant ship? She concluded, "Some songs are not composed, they are found. They exist in the silence between what is remembered and what is forgotten, waiting for someone to write them down. When We Were Many may be such a song, a hymn that has always existed, appearing to those who need to hear it, disappearing when its purpose is fulfilled." The hymnal remains in the church on the hill, stored in its protective case in the church office. It is occasionally shown to visitors who request to see it, though most congregants are unaware of its existence. The third pew from the back, where the hymnal was found, is still in use. A newer hymnal occupies the rack now, identical to the others in the church. No one sits in that pew with any particular frequency. No one reports anything unusual about it. The ship's log from the Providence remains at the Peabody Essex Museum, available to researchers by appointment. The hymn in its margins has not been erased or damaged. The words are still legible, if faded. The melody can still be played. No one has ever performed When We Were Many in a church service. No choir has ever sung it. The melody has never been recorded. The song exists only on paper, in two places, separated by a century, connected by no evident chain of transmission. Ruth Callahan, the choir director who discovered the hymnal in 1963, died in 2011. Before her death, she was asked if she had ever tried to sing the hymn. "Once," she said, "alone, in the sanctuary, after everyone had left. I wanted to hear what it sounded like." She was asked what it sounded like. "Sad," she said. "Not tragic, just sad. Like a goodbye that no one was there to hear. I didn't sing the last verse. I couldn't. It felt like singing it would make something true that hadn't happened yet." The last verse remains unsung. "When we are gone, who then shall sing? What voice shall fill the air?" The hymnal holds the words we leave for those who are not there. The hymnal holds the words. The church still stands. The congregation still gathers, Sunday after Sunday, singing hymns from the approved collections. But somewhere in the church office, in a protective case, a single book waits. And somewhere in a museum in Salem, a ship's log holds the same song, written by a man who drowned 230 years ago. The hymn exists in both places. It exists in neither. It exists in the space between what was sung and what will never be sung again. When we were many, when we were none. Sound requires air to travel, but for 8 minutes each year, the air in this church refuses to carry it. Bath is a small town in the upper Connecticut River Valley of New Hampshire, near the border with Vermont, where the White Mountains begin their descent toward the farmland of the North Country. The town was settled in 1765 and incorporated in 1761, one of the earlier communities established in the remote northern reaches of the state. It has never been large. The current population is barely 1,000, but it has maintained a quiet continuity across 2.5 centuries, its families rooted in the land, its institutions enduring through generations. The The brick church stands on the main road through town, a federal-style structure built in 1832 from locally fired bricks that have weathered to a deep russet red. It replaced an earlier wooden meeting house that had served the congregation since 1793. The interior is simple: white plaster walls, wooden pews, clear glass windows, a raised pulpit at the front. The acoustics are excellent. The proportions of the sanctuary were designed to carry the minister's voice to every corner without amplification. For 364 days of the year, the acoustics work exactly as intended. On November 19th, they do not work at all. The phenomenon was first formally documented in 1901 by Reverend Thomas Harding, who served the brick church from 1897 to 1919. Harding was a meticulous record keeper, maintaining detailed journals of his ministry that were later donated to the New Hampshire Historical Society. His entry for November 19, 1901, describes an experience that would be repeated with remarkable consistency for over a century. This morning, during the regular Sunday service, I experienced an event I cannot explain. At approximately 14 minutes past 10 o'clock, as I was reading from the Gospel of Matthew, my voice ceased to produce sound. I continued speaking. I could feel my vocal cords vibrating, feel the air passing through my throat, but no sound emerged. The congregation sat in apparent confusion. Several attempted to speak. I could see their lips moving, but heard nothing. A child dropped a hymn book. It struck the floor in complete silence. Harding noted that the silence lasted approximately 8 minutes, ending as suddenly as it had begun, at 22 minutes past 10. Normal sound resumed without explanation. The congregation sat in stunned quiet for several moments before Harding continued the service. "I have no explanation for what occurred," he wrote. "I can only record what I witnessed. For 8 minutes, no sound was possible within these walls. I spoke, but God did not permit them to listen." The phrase echoed something Harding had found in earlier church records, a reference he did not fully understand until he searched the archives. The oldest reference to the silence appears in the records of the original wooden meeting house, in an entry dated November 20th, 1811. The entry was written by Reverend Ezra Carpenter, who served the Bath congregation from 1803 to 1829. It reads, "Yesterday, the 19th of November, I delivered the morning sermon as scheduled. I spoke for the appointed time. The congregation sat attentive, but when I asked afterward if my words had been clear, Deacon Whitcomb informed me that no one had heard anything. They had watched me speak but had heard no sound. They had heard nothing at all, not my voice, not the rustle of their own clothing, not the wind outside. For some minutes," he said, "the church was as silent as a tomb. I do not know what to make of this. I spoke. God did not permit them to listen." Carpenter's entry establishes that the phenomenon occurred at least as early as 1811, 90 years before Harding's documentation. But Carpenter did not record the exact time of the silence, nor did he indicate whether it had occurred in previous years. Subsequent church records are incomplete. The congregation experienced periods of decline in the mid-19th century, and many documents were lost or discarded. No further references to the silence appear until Harding's 1901 account. But Harding, once aware of the phenomenon, began to investigate. Harding interviewed elderly members of the congregation, seeking anyone who might remember similar experiences from earlier decades. He found 3. An 82-year-old woman named Martha Aldrich recalled that her father had mentioned the quiet day in the church, a November morning when no one could hear the preaching. She could not recall the exact year, but believed it was in the 1850s. A 76-year-old farmer named Josiah Bowles remembered attending a service as a child, probably around 1860, when the minister's voice had suddenly stopped, though the minister continued to speak. "I thought I had gone deaf," Bowles told Harding, "but then it came back, all at once. I never forgot it." A 68-year-old woman named Patience Thayer reported that her grandmother had warned her about the Silent Sunday in the brick church, advising her to stay home on that particular day in November. She said it was the day the church remembered something it shouldn't have forgotten, Thayer told Harding. She never explained what that meant. Harding concluded that the silence had been occurring for at least half a century, probably longer, though the congregation had not systematically documented it. He resolved to record every occurrence going forward. His journals document the silence on November 19th in 1902, 1903, 1904, and every subsequent year until his retirement in 1919. The timing was consistent. The silence began between 10:12 and 10:16, lasted approximately 8 minutes, and ended between 10:20 and 10:24. The phenomenon occurred regardless of weather, congregation size, or the content of the service. Harding's successors continued the documentation. By 1950, the record spanned half a century of consistent observations, each minister confirming the same phenomenon: total silence inside the brick church on November 19th, lasting approximately 8 minutes in the mid-morning hours. In 1967, a minister named Reverend David Osgood invited a physicist from Dartmouth College to observe the phenomenon. The physicist, Dr. Harold Jennings, brought equipment to measure sound levels, air pressure, and temperature inside the sanctuary. His report, submitted to the church board in December of that year, documented what he called a complete acoustic anomaly. At 10:14 on November 19th, all sound measurements ceased, Jennings wrote. My instruments registered 0 decibels, not low sound but no sound. I attempted to produce noise by clapping, speaking, and striking objects together. My instruments detected no acoustic energy whatsoever. I could feel the impact of my hands clapping, but no sound was produced or transmitted. Jennings tested the air for unusual properties. He found nothing: normal composition, normal pressure, normal temperature. The air should have carried sound. It did not. At 10:22, sound returned instantaneously. There was no gradual resumption. One moment, complete silence. The next, normal acoustics. I have no explanation for this phenomenon. It contradicts fundamental principles of physics. Sound requires a medium, and the medium was present, yet no sound propagated. Jennings recommended further study. The church board declined, citing concerns about publicity and disruption to the congregation. The phenomenon has been observed by multiple researchers since Jennings's 1967 investigation, though formal studies remain rare. In 1983, an acoustic engineer from the University of New Hampshire named Dr. Patricia Sato conducted measurements during the silence. Her findings confirmed Jennings's observations: 0 acoustic propagation for exactly 8 minutes, with no detectable cause. In 2004, a team of graduate students from MIT attempted to record the phenomenon using high-sensitivity microphones and digital equipment. Their recordings show normal ambient sound until 10:13, then complete silence. Not even the electronic noise floor of their equipment until 10:21, when normal sound resumed. It's as if the air itself stopped vibrating, one student told a local newspaper. Sound is just pressure waves in air. For those 8 minutes, the air refused to wave. The researchers tested whether the phenomenon extended outside the church. It did not. Standing on the front steps, they could hear birds, wind, and traffic. The moment they stepped inside, silence. The boundary was precise, the threshold of the church door. The congregation has adapted to the annual silence in various ways. Some ministers schedule services to avoid the affected time, beginning at 11 o'clock instead of 10. Others continue through the silence, speaking words that no one can hear, trusting that the message matters, even if the sound does not. One minister, Reverend Ann Thornton, who served from 1991 to 2009, developed a practice of leading the congregation in silent prayer during the 8 minutes. If we cannot speak to each other, she explained in a 2005 interview, we can still speak to God. The silence is not empty. It is full of something we cannot hear. Some parishioners find the silence peaceful. Others find it deeply unsettling. A few refused to attend services on November 19th at all. A woman named Eleanor Hastings, who grew up in the congregation and attended services for over 70 years, described the experience in a 2012 oral history project. The first time I noticed it, I was maybe 7 or 8. The minister was preaching, and then he wasn't, or he was. But I couldn't hear him. I looked at my mother. She looked scared. I tried to ask what was happening, but no sound came out. I thought I had died. I thought we had all died. And then it was over, and the minister was still preaching, and my mother patted my hand and said, "It's just the quiet, dear. It happens every year." Hastings was asked if she knew why it happened. "No one knows," she said, "or if they do, they don't say." My grandmother used to say the church was remembering something. She said on that day, every year, the church goes back to a moment when something happened that shouldn't be forgotten. And during those 8 minutes, we're all there too, in that moment, whatever it was. We just can't hear what's being said. Church records offer no definitive explanation for the silence's origin. The November 19th, 1811, entry by Reverend Carpenter is the earliest known reference, but Carpenter provides no context, no indication of why that particular date, that particular year, might be significant. Local historians have searched for events that might explain the phenomenon. November 19th, 1811, was not a notable date in Bath's history. No deaths, no disasters, no significant occurrences are recorded. The town was quiet. The nation was at peace. Nothing happened, or nothing that anyone chose to document. But Patience Thayer's grandmother had said the church remembered something it shouldn't have forgotten, and Reverend Carpenter had written, "I spoke. God did not permit them to listen." Perhaps something was said on November 19th, 1811, that was not meant to be heard. Perhaps the silence is not a malfunction, but a correction, the church ensuring that certain words once spoken can never be spoken again. Or perhaps something was said that needs to be repeated year after year in a voice that no living ear can perceive. The Brick Church in Bath continues to hold services every Sunday. November 19th falls on a Sunday approximately once every 7 years. When it does, the congregation gathers as usual, the minister preaches as usual, and at approximately 10:14, the silence descends. For 8 minutes, no sound can be made inside the church. No voice, no footstep, no breath. The congregation sits in perfect stillness, watching each other, watching the minister's lips move without sound, watching the light through the windows, in a quiet so complete it feels like a presence. Then, at 10:22, the sound returns, suddenly, completely, as if a switch has been thrown. The minister's voice fills the sanctuary. The rustle of clothing resumes. The world comes back. No one applauds. No one comments. The service continues as if nothing unusual has occurred, because in Bath, New Hampshire, the silence is not unusual. It is expected. It is annual. It is as much a part of November 19th as the date itself. The church remembers something. Every year, for 8 minutes, it goes back to that moment. And whatever was said there, whatever sermon was preached, whatever confession was made, whatever words were spoken that God did not permit the congregation to hear, it echoes still in a silence so deep that 2 centuries have not been enough to fill it. Stone holds what we carve into it, but some carvings should not be possible. Hillsborough lies in the rolling hills of south-central New Hampshire, a town of modest size and quiet history that has produced one notable figure, Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, and otherwise remained largely unremarkable. It was settled in the 1740s and incorporated in 1772, drawing families from Massachusetts who sought farmland in the interior. The terrain is gentle, the soil adequate, the winters long. It is a place where people have lived and died for 2.5 centuries without attracting much attention from the wider world. The original meeting house of Hillsborough was built in 1773, a timber-framed structure on a stone foundation that served the congregation for over a century. By the 1880s, the building had deteriorated beyond practical repair. The roof leaked, the walls sagged, the floor had begun to rot. In 1884, the congregation voted to demolish the old meeting house and construct a new church on the same site, using the original foundation. The demolition began in April of that year. Workers dismantled the wooden structure methodically, salvaging what lumber could be reused, hauling the rest away for disposal. By May, only the stone foundation remained, granite blocks cut from local quarries and laid in 1773, still solid after 111 years. It was then that a stonemason named Ezra Goodwin noticed something unusual. On the interior face of the foundation's eastern wall, hidden for over a century beneath the floorboards of the meeting house, someone had carved words into the stone. The carving was crude but legible, cut into the granite with a chisel or similar tool. It consisted of a single word, return, carved in capital letters approximately 3 inches tall. Below the word was a date, 1941. Goodwin summoned the construction foreman, who summoned the minister, who summoned the church board. They examined the carving in bewildered silence. The foundation had been laid in 1773. The stone had been covered by floorboards since the building's construction. No one could have accessed the interior face of the foundation without tearing up the floor, and no record existed of any such work in the meeting house's 111-year history. Yet the carving was there, weathered to the same degree as the surrounding stone, as if it had been cut at the time of construction. And it bore a date that would not arrive for another 57 years. The church board debated what to do. Some proposed that the carving be removed, chiseled away, plastered over, forgotten. Others argued that it should be preserved as a curiosity, perhaps even a sign of divine prophecy. A few suggested that the date was a hoax, carved recently by someone who had somehow gained access to the foundation. But the weathering patterns were examined by a local geologist, who concluded that the carving had been exposed to the same conditions as the rest of the stone for a very long time, certainly decades, probably longer. The chisel marks were worn smooth. Lichen had begun to grow in the grooves. The carving was old. In the end, the board chose to do nothing. The new church was built over the same foundation, covering the carving once more. The incident was recorded in the church minutes, but not publicized. The name Return and the date 1941 remained hidden beneath the floor of the new sanctuary, and the congregation waited to see what would happen when 1941 arrived. Most of those who had witnessed the carving in 1884 were dead by 1941. Ezra Goodwin had died in 1907. The minister who had examined the stone, Reverend Isaiah Clement, had died in 1923. The church board members had all passed by 1935. But the minutes of the 1884 meeting remained in the church archives, and at least one person had read them, Reverend Charles Hallowell, who served the Hillsborough Church from 1938 to 1952. Hallowell was a careful man, educated at Yale Divinity School, not given to superstition or sensationalism. But he had studied the 1884 records, and as 1941 approached, he found himself watching for someone connected to the name carved in the foundation. He did not have to wait long. On March 15, 1941, a man walked into the Hillsborough Church during the afternoon, when the building was empty. The sexton, a woman named Harriet Prescott, was cleaning the sanctuary when the stranger entered. She described him later as middle-aged, well-dressed, quiet. He did not speak to her. He walked directly to a pew near the center of the church, sat down, and remained motionless. Prescott continued her work, glancing at him occasionally. The man did not pray, did not read, did not move. He simply sat staring at the front of the sanctuary, his hands folded in his lap. After approximately 1 hour, he rose, walked to the door, and left without a word. Prescott was unsettled by the encounter. She mentioned it to Reverend Hallowell that evening. Hallowell asked if the man had given his name. She said he had not spoken at all, but she had noticed something. When the man left, she had followed him to the door and watched him walk to his car, parked on the street outside. The car had Massachusetts plates, and on the driver's door, in small gold letters, was a name, W. Return. Hallowell was disturbed by the coincidence, if it was a coincidence. He contacted the Hillsborough police and asked them to investigate the visitor. The police chief, a man named Donald Stokes, made inquiries with Massachusetts authorities. The car was registered to a man named Walter Return, age 41, resident of Worcester, Massachusetts. Return was a salesman for a textile company, unmarried, with no criminal record, and no known connection to New Hampshire. Stokes asked Massachusetts police to contact Return and inquire about his visit to Hillsborough. The response came 2 days later, on March 17th. Walter Return was dead. His body had been found on the morning of March 16th, in his car, parked on a rural road at the Hillsborough town line. The car was facing south, away from Hillsborough, toward Massachusetts. Return was in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, eyes open. There was no sign of injury, no indication of foul play, no evidence of struggle. The coroner determined that Return had died of cardiac arrest, a heart attack, sudden and fatal. The time of death was estimated as late evening on March 15th, approximately 6 hours after he had left the Hillsborough church. He was 41 years old. Reverend Hallowell investigated Walter Return's background as thoroughly as he could. Return had no family in New Hampshire. His parents were both deceased. He had no siblings, no wife, no children. He had been born in Worcester in 1900, lived there his entire life, and worked for the same textile company since 1922. Nothing in his history explained why he would drive to Hillsborough, New Hampshire, sit in a church for an hour, and die at the town line the same night. Hallowell contacted Return's employer, his neighbors, his few known acquaintances. None could explain the trip. Return had not mentioned Hillsborough to anyone. He had no appointments in New Hampshire, no business interests, no friends or relatives in the region. He had simply driven north one day, entered a church, sat in silence, and died. The name carved in the foundation, Return, matched his surname exactly. The date, 1941, matched the year exactly. The man had been 41 years old. Hallowell did not know what to make of this. He recorded his findings in a private journal, which was discovered among his papers after his death in 1978. The journal includes a final entry on the subject, dated April of 1941. I do not believe in prophecy. I do not believe that a stone laid in 1773 can predict events in 1941. But I cannot explain what has happened. A name was carved in the foundation 168 years ago. A man bearing that name came to this church, sat in silence, and died the same day. He had no reason to be here. He spoke to no one. He left nothing behind but a question that cannot be answered. How did someone in 1773 know his name, and why did he come? The carving remains beneath the floor of the Hillsborough Church, still hidden, still unexplained. In 1993, during a renovation project, a construction crew briefly exposed a portion of the original foundation. A worker noticed markings on the stone and asked about them. The church board, still aware of the 1884 records, instructed the crew to cover the stone without examining it further. Some things are better left buried, the board chair explained to a curious parishioner. The foundation has held the church for 200 years. We don't need to know what's written on it. No one has examined the carving since. No one knows if the weathering has progressed, if the letters have faded, or if additional marks have appeared. Walter Return is buried in Worcester, Massachusetts, in a modest grave marked only with his name and dates, 1900 to 1941. No one visits the grave. He left no heirs, no legacy, no explanation for the strange journey that ended at the Hillsborough town line. The church continues to hold services every Sunday. The congregation gathers, sings hymns, hears sermons, and departs without knowing what lies beneath their feet. A name in the foundation, a date that arrived and passed. A man who came when he was called, or summoned or drawn, and died before he could explain why. Reverend Hallowell's journal ends with a question he never answered. Why did Walter Return come to Hillsborough? He sat in the church for an hour, silent, staring. What was he looking for? What did he see? And when he left, when he drove to the edge of town and stopped, was he trying to escape? Or was he waiting for something to follow him? The town line where Return died is unremarkable. A rural road, a faded sign, a boundary between Hillsborough and the next town south. There is no memorial, no marker, no indication that anything unusual occurred there, but the foundation stone remains. The name Return remains. And somewhere in the records of a small New Hampshire church, there is a question that has waited for answers since 1773. A question carved in granite, hidden from view, patient and permanent. Who knew, 168 years before he arrived, that Walter Return would come to Hillsborough? And who, or what, was waiting for him when he did?